Okay, so just to remind members, the meeting will be broadcast online throughout Parliament buildings. I just want to welcome anybody watching online today. If you can ensure your mobile phones are muted, thank you. And to remind you that no recording or photography of the meeting is allowed. Okay, members, if you're content, we'll proceed through the agenda. So we haven't received apologies, although we are awaiting 2 of our members joining online. Hopefully they'll be with us shortly. Any declarations of interest to declare? Okay, go ahead, please.
So, seeing correspondence, there's a letter from the Communities Committee, so just to declare I'm a member of Communities Committee.
Thank you very much, Brad.
Yep.
Noted, thank you. Okay, Chairperson's business. So, just to advise members, as per the email to members on Monday, that the Deputy Chairperson, the Clerk and myself met informally with the co-chairs of the Truth Recovery Independent Panel meeting this morning, and there will be, as per recent correspondence, and just to advise, a note of this meeting will be circulated. I suppose in terms of actions going forward, then we discussed quite a bit around the bill and how they'll add value in terms of what they've gleaned during that process. So they are due to come before us in a few weeks, but it sort of corresponds with the end of their taking of evidence, so that they may provide us with a written update at that point. But I think we'll be moving forward. We are going to have a formal response in terms of discussion around the independent panel at committee a few weeks back. Anything else to add?
No.
Okay.
On next week's agenda.
Oh yes, we'll put it on next week's agenda then. Okay, so draft minutes, members, you'll find these on pages 6 to 14 of the pack, and if you're content that these are a true reflection of the proceedings held on the 19th of March, I will go ahead and sign those. Okay, thank you. So matters arising, you'll find refer you to page 15 of the pack, and there are 3 items that should be considered under matters arising today. The first is the responses to historical institutional abuse in Great Britain. You'll recall last week Thomas Luff gave us a presentation. He's now submitted an updated presentation, and you'll find this at pages 18 to 29 of the meeting pack. Members Rise has sent the updated slides, and these specifically relate to the redress processes in Great Britain. There's also a Rise briefing note on the Scotland's redress scheme. You'll find that at pages 30 to 35 of the meeting pack. Rise have prepared a briefing note which provides further information on the organisations named on the contributor list for Scotland's redress scheme, as requested by this committee last week. And then at pages 36 to 39 you will find a response from the departmental assembly liaison officer in terms of truth recovery. The department has responded to the committee's letter from the 4th of February requesting information following the committee's evidence session from truth recovery officials at its meeting on the 29th of January. Okay, so we will deal with that next week if members are content. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. Just to draw attention to the Scottish redress, Thomas has got us the figures and got them very promptly.
Yes, very good.
Very efficient. Excellent work getting that turned around. So we know that there's contributions totalling over 122 million, and there's 2 names on that list. Bernardo's. The max figure is 1.25 million, and the Sisters of Nazareth 5.75 million max figure agreed to pay. How we have handled this in Northern Ireland so wrongly that it seems as if we're struggling to get money out of these organisations, even though they've already committed substantial amounts of money to the Scottish redress scheme. So if we are doing something like this in future, we really need to take stock of the way we've handled this and the kid glove approach that we have taken to these organisations. The Scottish Government has done it and done it right. Yep. They've got substantial amounts of money out of organisations that have committed this harm to people. And they need held accountable both in the law and financially. But there has to be an expectation that we get vast sums of money out of these 2 organisations because they've committed to it in another part of the United Kingdom.
Okay, thank you. Very much agree with you there, Timothy. I wonder, Clark, could you maybe speak to some of the background work you've been doing this week in terms, or some sort of thoughts in terms of how you would take this forward, please?
Yes. So last week, if you remember, after the briefing with Thomas. The committee identified about 7 or 8 points where they wanted more information about how things were done in Scotland. So we have included a draft in there for you to have a look, just to be sure that we've captured correctly what it is that you asked us last week, and perhaps having reflected on some, the response that came from TEO or some of the other things that were in the raised paper. If there was anything additional you wanted us to include in that. So that's the first point of having that in. The second point is that I've reached out to, I'm in the process of engaging with your opposite number, the relevant committee in Scotland, which is the Education, Children and Young People Committee, and they have responsibility for the child abuse inquiry that corresponds to this, and the Redress Scotland. So, as I say, I've been in contact with them just to take some advice from them as to who the key individuals are that you might want to engage with in Scotland, and also to see if there's a way of engaging this committee engaging with either that committee or some of the relevant authorities in Scotland. So, for example, Redress Scotland or the inquiry team or the relevant part of the Scottish Government, just to have a conversation with them about what lessons they'd share. Their inquiry has been going on for 10 years. They did take a different approach to the one in Northern Ireland, but it might be an opportunity to do that. So if you're content, I'll keep down that road, and we'll identify what opportunities there are, either virtually or in person, to exchange, as well as doing some initial correspondence.
I suppose very conscious that the closing date for applications for the HIA redress scheme here is pending, and I suppose what we have been very conscious as a committee has been around the contributions from the institutions here, and in many ways we've been advised, look, can we just wait and see how many applications are in and the total cost, and then that will give the facilitator who's been working with the institutions a better understanding of how much money is required. So it's been something that's been simmering for us in the background, but I think that this work is going to really inform us once we get past this pending deadline. Carol, would you like to come in?
Yeah, apologies for being late. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be helpful to look at elsewhere, either by Zoom, in person, or both. We're all acting in good faith to try and get the very best outcomes for victims and survivors. And we want to make sure that every institution has to contribute to any redress. I just feel that these negotiations that involve Paul Sweeney and the institutions could be certainly ongoing for some time. And our ability to scrutinise and even just to put down routes of what best practice would look like would be really helpful for us all. So, Roisin, I think that's a very, very helpful suggestion. And just to put it on record, Thomas's research last week I thought was very good, and it highlighted that other institutions are well ahead of us. So I think we can learn some lessons from those. So thank you.
Great. Carol, we're just wondering then around, I think you maybe mentioned it previously, around some more research in terms of the Republic of Ireland. Is that still something that you think we should be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, the issue that keeps coming up, and we've all encountered it on the committee, certainly in the closed sessions, but I know many of us have met the groups. I mean, I'm only on this committee from we got back, and certainly Sinead and others and yourselves have been there a lot longer. But I mean, the whole issue around the way the Irish government then closed the records has been an ongoing issue for families trying to get access to their records. That's one aspect. This arbitrary figure of whatever £10,000, how that was reached. But more importantly, I don't think they've handled the HIA very well. The Irish government have handled it very well. So even if we can find out what not to do, I think it would be a worthwhile exercise.
Yeah, sorry, very much in terms of informing how we take forward the inquiry, the legislation around the inquiry and the redress here. Anybody else any comments before we move on? Go ahead.
Just one other matter arising. We had the conversation last week about the Windsor Framework text. Have we any update or?
Sorry, not yet. I have put in the letter of query has gone into the department asking for a response, and we'll await that. I don't anticipate, I haven't heard that there's going to be any delay, so it has gone in. I also spoke to the European Affairs Officer Manager, and I have asked her to brief us. She sent us some initial materials, but she said she's happy to come and discuss if that's what we want. So I hadn't rescheduled anything because I was waiting to see what's come back from the department, and then put together the briefing from the EU manager, affairs manager, and the information from the department at the same time, and bring them back together. Is that okay with you?
Yep.
Okay, I just have a few other matters that are arising. Just in terms of last week's business, we looked at the Executive Office draft Climate Commissioner regulations, and there were some queries that were put in around those. So just to seek your agreement to note the items, and we will consider the contents under item number 6 today in terms of the regulations. But just to move on then, in terms of the Victims Payment Scheme, we talked last week about a panel session. So just to remind you that we want to schedule an oral evidence session with Relatives for Justice and other organisations as part of a wider panel session on the Victims Payment Scheme. So Sarah Ann, thank you so much. You emailed us out and asked for some suggestions. So far the team here have received the following. So it's approaching the Commission for Victims and Survivors, South East Fermanagh Foundation, the Eli Centre, Wave, Ashton. Anybody got any other suggestions for any other groups? I think that we will also be asking the Commission for some suggestions as well. But we're looking to convene this panel at a meeting in May. So if you can have any suggestions through to the clerk and our team before that, it'd be appreciated. Okay. So the committee team will also prepare a note on proposed panel sessions, so we'll be able to get all the background we need in advance of that. So moving on then, members, so the draft Northern Ireland Climate Commissioner Regulations Northern Ireland 2025. So I'm going to refer you to pages 95 to 99 of your pack for a cover note, 102 to 106 for the draft statutory rule, pages 107 to 110 for the explanatory memorandum, and then in your table packs, pages 5 to 13, the official report of briefing from TO officials at the meeting on the 19th of March, pages 14 to 16 for a response dated 21st of March from TO to the committee's request for further information last week, and pages 16 to 28 of the table pack for the Examiner of Statutory Rules report. So just to remind you, this SR will allow for the Executive Office to establish an independent office to be known as the Northern Ireland Climate Commissioner, and to allow the NICC to have the following functions: oversee and report on the exercise of functions of Northern Ireland departments under the Act, provide advice and make recommendations to Northern Ireland departments on the operations of the Act, undertake or commission research containing the operations of the Act, monitor the implementation of climate action plans and sectoral policies, and publish reports, advice and recommendations and other relevant information relating to the operations of the Act. So just to advise, the proposed statutory rule is to be subject to the draft affirmative resolution procedure for the Assembly, meaning that it shall not be made until laid in draft and approved by the Assembly. Just to remind you that we considered the SL1 at our meeting on the 15th of January, and there were no objections to the proposed statutory rule. The committee heard oral evidence from the Department of the Statutory Rule last week at our meeting and agreed to formally consider whether it's content with the statutory rule as drafted following the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, which was published yesterday. There have been no changes to the policy content since the SL1 was submitted to the committee, and just to advise, the committee has also agreed to write to the Department to request the detailed breakdown of the £1 million per annum estimated cost for the establishment of the Commissioner's Office, including accounts for salaries of the Commissioner, their staff and infrastructure costs. A response can be found on pages 14 of the table pack. Does anyone want to speak to those? Go ahead, please.
Yep. Well, Chair, just on behalf of Harry and myself, we do have strong concerns about proceeding with regulations to create an additional Commissioner at this time. So as we heard last week, the position will involve a budget of around £1 million. and we're aware, even in the financial statement at Westminster today, how tight public funds are at this time. So we do question whether that is the best use of scarce public funds. So we will not be supporting this at committee at this stage. We're certainly constantly improving how we look after our environment is an important matter under the democratic auspices of the executive as a whole, ministers and their departments. But we're not convinced of the need to create another layer of bureaucracy in doing that.
Okay, thank you. That's noted. I'll refer to the clerk in a minute when we're here. I think Timothy's looking in now.
Just to echo some of the comments that I made last week about the prioritisation of this. This will be the first Commissioner for Climate in the UK. I still haven't seen any justification as why we're pushing ahead and committing this large sum of money. I do believe it will bring a lot of red tape and burdens to local business. Them concerns haven't been alleviated, so like Brian and Harry, I'm certainly not in favour. I don't think this is the right time, and why we should be stepping forward. Yes, it's in legislation, but why we should be stepping forward and hailing this as some sort of a win, that we're creating this post for the first in the UK, I certainly don't believe is the way to go. This is creating an empire, and an empire that will put significant constraints, I believe, in business, and that's something that I'm not prepared to support.
Okay, anybody else got any comments? Please go ahead, Claire.
Can I just ask a question in relation to our statutory responsibilities around this and why this SR has come to this committee at this point? Because I think there's a suggestion that we're pressing ahead with this because of political interest, when I believe this is actually a fairly functional process in and around legislation. Can we just confirm that?
Okay, well, my understanding is that obviously that it comes before this committee because of the cross-departmental nature, and as you recall last week the departmental official just sort of outlined why it's going to stay here as opposed to move to ERA, for example, because it's cross-departmental. And it is on the face of the primary legislation that went through the Assembly that these regulations, I think this had to be within 2 years or something. So I think what we're doing is just following the procedural requirements of this committee to consider the statutory rule, scrutinise it, speak to the departmental officials, and then allow it to proceed. Would you like to add to that?
No.
Okay. I have a bit more to get through, and then we will put it to members if that's okay. So the Examiner of Statutory Rules has no issues to raise as per her report. However, she did state that the draft regulations contain a number of typographical errors which have arisen as a result of a technical drafting issue. The department has confirmed that it will correct these minor errors at its earliest opportunity. I am content with the approach of the department on this instance. Okay, so I think members have raised issues. Do anybody else want to raise any before I put the question? Okay, so I would be putting the question to you, but just like a bit of clarity, please. Brian first, because you spoke first. Are you not content now in terms of for a couple of weeks, or is this something that you do not feel that you will be able to agree to?
Well, the timescale will be more than a couple of weeks, so we're just concerned with the position of public finances, and just that we create these extra commissioner posts, and do they really add value? That ultimately things need to be under democratic ownership, through elected members in the Assembly, through ministers, through departments. So we just think at this time, rather than adding another layer to that bureaucracy, we should be keeping the focus on the democratic structures. So it's not a matter that will be sorted out in a couple of weeks, I don't foresee.
Okay, so I think I will put it to the question, and then possibly we'll have to go to a vote. Okay, so I'm just going to put the question to members. Carol, can you hear okay? Yes? Yeah, okay. So the question is that the Committee for the Executive Office has considered the draft SR, the Northern Ireland Climate Commissioner Regulations Northern Ireland 2025, and recommends that it is approved by the Assembly. So are members content?
No.
Okay, so I will ask for a show of hands then for content. Okay, so that would be 5. And
Sorry, just for the record, I'll just say, so we have Carol Newcillen, we have Claire Sugden, we have Anya Murphy, we have Sinead McLaughlin, Paula Bradshaw,
okay, and those who are opposed? Okay.
Harry Harvey, Brian Kingston and Timothy Gaston.
Okay, so could you please advise then, because of the majority, we're content for this to go back to the department to say that this committee's agreed, but it will have to be laid in the Assembly?
So the committee has agreed, has recommended that it be approved, so it's in favour of this. So that's the result of that vote, and that's what will be reflected in the question. It will then be for the department how it wishes to proceed after that.
Okay.
Yeah, and our concerns will be noted, Chair. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Harry. Okay, members, we'll move on then to item 7, SR, the Fair Employment Specification of Public Authorities Amendment Order Northern Ireland 2025. So I would refer you to pages 125 to 127 of the pack for a cover note, pages 130 to 135 for the draft statutory rule, pages 136 to 138 of your pack for the explanatory memorandum, and pages 16 to 28 of the tabled pack for the Examiner Statutory Rules report. Just to remind you that the SR proposes for the Executive Office to make a statutory rule under powers conferred by Articles 50 and 51 of the Fair Employment and Treatment Northern Ireland Order 1998. The statutory rule will amend the schedule to the Fair Employment Specification of Public Authorities Order Northern Ireland 2004, and just to advise that the proposed SR is to be subject to the negative resolution procedure, and the end of the statutory period for this SR is 6th of May 2025. The committee considered the SL1 at our meeting on the 19th of February this year and had no objections to the proposed rule. And just to inform that the Examiner of Statutory Rules noted the rule had been laid in breach of the 21-day rule, and the Examiner states that the order was made on the 19th of February 2025, was laid on the 19th of March 2025 and will come into force on the 31st of March 2025. The Department has acknowledged in correspondence the breach of the 21-day rule, and the Department, stating its regret for the breach, has advised that the order was laid in breach of the 21-day rule as a result of an administrative error, and the Examiner Statutory Rule states that she is content that the Department has provided a satisfactory explanation for the breach in this instance, and the Examiner has no further issues to raise. So, members, any issues they'd like to raise in relation to this? No? Okay, so anything? No? Okay. So I'm just going to put the following question. The question is that the Committee for the Executive Office has considered the SR 2025 number 34, the Fair Employment Specification of Public Authorities Amendment Order Northern Ireland 2025, and has no objection to the rule. Are we agreed? Yeah. Okay. Anyone against? Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to our first oral briefing session, members. So we have departmental officials here to talk about the Executive Office's budget for 2025 to 2026. I would refer you to pages 140 to 142 of the pack for the clerk's brief, pages 143 to 150 for the departmental briefing paper on the budget, and I would welcome to the meeting Ronan Murda, Grade 5 Finance, and Paula Shearer, Grade 7 Financial Management and Budgeting. So you're very welcome, both of you, and I understand that you're going to use your opening remarks to cover some of the queries that we submitted during the week. So take your time. Obviously the committee is keen to hear your answers, so please be as thorough as you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Many thanks for the opportunity to attend the committee today in order to provide some further detail on the briefing for Budget 25-26. The committee has been provided with a briefing paper which gave an overview of the approach and outlines the bids that were submitted. I wasn't going to be proposing to go into that paper in detail, but just to give a very high-level overview as a reminder. And it touches on the allocations for the proposals for 25-26 in response to those bids. We've received your follow-up questions and hope to address those today. We continue to be mindful of the challenges facing all departments and the environment in which we continue to operate. And in response to non-earmarked resource DEL bids of 14.7 million, we were allocated 4.6 million, 2 million of which has been provided on an earmarked basis, specifically for ending violence against women and girls. And for earmarked resource DEL bids of 168.9 million in respect of victims' payments, HIA and truth recovery, we've been provided with an allocation of £150 million. We've been allocated 2.5 million earmarked in respect of Peace Plus, and that was informed by Department of Finance and SEUPB, so it didn't form part of our bids, but it has been allocated to us. And for Capital DEL, we've been allocated £14 million in response to bids totalling 16.3. So Ministers have approved decisions on initial spending plans in respect of these allocations, and we've sought to maintain frontline services and delivery levels and commitments as far as possible. We will, however, continue to address shortfalls during the year through in-year monitoring and careful management. As previously mentioned, the Department also expects to receive allocations in respect of communities in transition, Windsor Framework, and refugees and asylum seekers integration and support during the year. So these are matters that are separate to the budget 25-26 opening allocations. So the written briefing has provided the members, has been provided to the members. I hope that's been helpful, but I'm happy to address these matters in relation to the letter from the committee. So if I then work through these. The first question from the committee...
Sorry, hold on a second. Okay. Oh, sorry, I forgot to check. Is everybody content this will be hand-sorted? Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry, please proceed.
The first question that the committee was in relation to capital spend of £14 million, which included health and safety works at Maze Long Cash, and the committee had requested further details on the works and the cost of those works on the site. So the £1 million bid from MLK for health and safety works can be broken down as follows: $550,000 for essential health and safety capital works to the World War II hangar rear doors, £100,000 for the hangar asbestos removal and rooms restoration, and it's health and safety bringing the space into meanwhile use with the Ulster Aviation Society, and this is required in advance of the next phase of the works to the hangar's roofs, trusses and columns. The UAS hangars are in active use by the charity, who attract in the order of 10,000 visitors per annum. And so focus on health and safety for public access is an important issue. Health and safety works to scheduled monuments, blaster shelters and pillboxes and associated lands covers £100,000, and that's required in respect of MLK's statutory duty to protect scheduled monuments, so it's a legislative requirement. And then site-wide health and safety minor capital works of £250,000, and that's a planned programme of works in reaction to health and safety issues and to support public access to site occupiers. So happy to take any questions on that.
I'm happy enough.
Okay.
One thing I would like to say, maybe this might be timely. Obviously, the site's under this committee. We were at Ebrington before. Mm-hmm. Is there any possibility at some stage in the future that we go and visit the Maze site?
Yeah, I think the Economy Committee are going to...
They've been.
It's done. It's done already? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay. We'll put that in the forward work programme. Go ahead, please. Thank you.
The next question centred on communities in transition, and it was the bid of £1.4 million, and that's the bid that wasn't successful in the opening allocations. And the bid seeks to support organisations helping to deliver the objectives, including the EVOG strategy as well. A list of the successful applicants was requested and detail on the selection process, including what steps were taken to ensure regional balance. And first of all, just to be very clear, I feel I should point out CIT and EVOG are very separate programmes. So in terms of the wording, although there's an important read across in that exploitation of children by paramilitaries is an issue in a number of CIT areas, there's no duplication of funding. We're in the process of awarding CIT contracts at the moment, so we can't give a list of organisations at this stage. What I would say is that, or could confirm, is that the contracts will cover the CIT areas. So by way of regional balance, I thought it was worth just reminding the North Down being Kilcooley and Rathgill, West Belfast covering Lower Falls, Twinbrook, Poleglass, Upper Springfield, Turf Lodge and Ballymurphy, East Belfast covering the Mount and Ballymacarrat, Shankill, Derry Londonderry covering Brandywell and Cregan, Carrickfergus Larne covering Antiville, Kilwater in Larne and Northland, and Castlemara and Carrickfergus, North Belfast being New Lodge and Ardoyne, and Lurgan covering Drumbagask and Kilwilkie. And in the case of Evo, just for completeness, that's covering all the council areas. And I'm aware that committee are receiving evidence from colleagues specifically on CIT later on today.
But I think, Brian, have you a question now?
Yeah, no, well, I mean,
Thank you.
we'll raise the questions later, but can you just clarify, did you say the EVAG strategy bid was not successful, the 1.4
No,
million?
sorry, the CIT. The CIT bid.
The
The 1.4. So the reference to the
from
one.
communities in transition, the bid to ending violence against women and girls.
No, it's a separate programme. It's a separate programme. There was reference in the briefing that was talking about the delivery of both programmes, but this is a separate and distinct funding issue. This is just purely talking about communities in transition.
Okay. Okay, the way it's worded here, I thought maybe the Communities and Transition team had made a bid for funding.
No, apologies. No, that's
okay.
That's
well, the other question I have, and I'll raise it later, is there any review of the community in transitions areas taking place? Certainly in North Belfast, there's large parts of the community are left out.
Reviews in terms of location would be subject to funding, but again, I would probably
that we can
defer to
put that up
colleagues
later.
in the next session.
Yeah.
Okay. Timothy, did you want in on this one?
Yeah, and it's probably a question for later on. So last year, in answer to a table question, there's contracts totaling 3.78 million handed out. Is that the same figure this year? And when do you believe that them contracts will be in place? Obviously, we are a number of days away from the end of the financial year. Is it an expectation that those that will have secured contracts will be preparing to hit the ground running at the start of the financial year? Or is this process going to take a number of weeks or months to bottom out?
In terms of the finance, I should probably clarify then, the 1.4 million additional bid wasn't successful. So for CIT, it would be the money coming from the Executive Programme on Paramilitarism and Organised Crime, and that's 2.9 million. In terms of the contract awarding process, again, I would defer
We'll pick that up
to
in the next
colleagues
one.
in the next session.
No, sorry. So that's 2.9 million for contracts this year. So that's $1 million less than what was given out last year.
Okay, anything else? Okay, do you want to move on, please? Thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jeff, please.
Ask a question about the Northwest Development Fund. The allocation, you know, just the failure to kind of match fund the Irish government. Can you give me any background? You said that it's under consideration there.
The Executive Office remains committed in terms of supporting the Northwest region and the Northwest Strategic Growth Partnership structures, and officials have engaged with the Irish Government counterparts to investigate how best to support the region. And going forward, we want to focus on transformational change, and that's required within the region, and how best to utilise the structures that are in place, like the Northwest Strategic Growth Partnership to support that change. So we're considering next steps in terms of that. At the moment there isn't an allocation, but we'd bring forward bids through monitoring in year once there's further clarity on that.
Okay, you have no idea of the time scale?
No, I don't at present, no.
All right, okay, because it's fairly critical in terms of time scale at the minute because the resources are now complete.
Okay. We'll proceed. Thank you, Ronan.
Moving on, point 3 was good relations, and good relations additional allocation of 0.75 million, and the question from the committee was whether that allocation was to lead on for TEO to lead on projects, or whether these were funds for councils to deliver projects within the area, and this 0.75 million allocation is in addition to the baseline, and that's intended to be split equally across central and district good relations. So it will be split between the projects delivered by TEO and by the councils themselves. Okay. Question 4 again on good relations, centred on the bid, which was 2.7 million. Obviously not all of that bid was met. It comprised central and good relations, central and district good relations. And the question was whether there was any plans for further phases. The 2.7 million is split across both. Ultimately, whether there's further phases will be subject to funding, so that would inform any additional bids during the year. At the moment, we would have the opening baseline plus the 0.75 million referenced in the earlier question. So it would form part of any additional bids to be brought forward beyond monitoring, but they would be subject to funding considerations.
Okay, go ahead, Timothy.
Yeah, so the $750,000 that's been split between central government and local government. So half of that's going to councils. Have councils, lobbied or put in bids of what they would need to carry out the projects, or has TEO decided we're going to put in a bid of 2.something million, then whatever we get we split with councils? From my time in local government, it was always very reactionary of, we've got this money from Stormont, what are we going to spend it on?
That's probably more for colleagues within good relations. What I would say is the bid for 2.7 million was with a view to restoring back to the pre-23-24 reductions that took place. So it was to go back to that sort of level of allocations. The 0.75 million is essentially to maintain the funding as it stands at the moment. So that's the basis. It's to make sure that we're not reducing good relations. So whether that has been in detail discussions with the delivery partners would be a matter for the good relations colleagues. I would need to discuss that with them to check.
Okay.
Question 5 was on Intertrade UK and whether there were any bids submitted to TEO in respect of funding for this body. And the short answer to that is no. TEO doesn't hold responsibility for the funding for Intertrade UK, so no bids would have been brought forward to this organisation. It's a non-departmental public body, so its funding would be the responsibility of its sponsor department, and that was initially Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and is now the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, but the funding would come from them.
I get your point on that, but when you look at some of the staffing that does sit within TEO regarding the EU department, surely then the best fit for Intertrade UK would be the Executive Office, because they have other functions. Yes, the ERA Minister has checks at the port, but when it comes to some of the Windsor framework and the staffing of that, it sits within this department. So I believe if there was a bid to be submitted for Intertrade UK, there is the argument to me that it should come from here.
I could certainly bring that back to the department. Equally, I think Intertrade would probably be seen as more of an economic type organisation from our perspective, but I can certainly bring that back.
Because of the cross-cutting nature, I think you could make the argument that it sits under TEO. Go on ahead, Sinead.
No, it's one of the economic drivers for all island trade, and I think, to be honest with you, you'd be better for the paper that you're talking about to sit in the economy as well.
Well, it's not for all island, it's across the UK primarily.
But what he's comparing it to Intertrade Ireland, I'm saying it is clearly within the Department for Economy, clearly. And it wouldn't be within the remit of TEO.
Quite a lot to get through. Please, quiet. Please go ahead, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry. Question 6 was then with regard to the non-departmental public bodies who are being allocated a total of 0.65 million, and the fact that we had highlighted that there was limited funding available and it was only possible to partially meet the needs for pay and inflationary pressures over and above the baselines that were brought forward by our NDPBs, and the committee had asked for a list of the NDPBs that refers to and a list of the ALBs that have registered pressures in respect of costs that can't be managed within the baseline allocation, and whether the pressures in respect of these costs relate to the national insurance increases. Several of our NDPBs registered pressures that would be challenging to manage within a baseline, and I think I could probably list all of them, in fact. Corsica, I would point out, are funded from within the earmarked fund, so they would be treated separately and funded within earmarked. But it would be challenging for any of the other arm's length bodies, and they've registered that. We've been in a position where we've been able to allocate 0.65 million towards their bids, but that is, yes, towards paying other bids as well as paying inflationary, but it doesn't cover all the bids that they brought forward, simply because of affordability issues, which is the same position that the department's in, and I think all other departments will be, that nobody got the money that they were hoping for in terms of the budget settlements, and efficiencies will be required.
Right, Ronan, before you go on then, so in terms of the financial pressures that these arm's length bodies and non-departmental public bodies are experiencing at the minute, do you have a role within the Finance Department of the Executive Office to provide them with some sort of support and guidance in terms of, with the changes in national insurance, for example, and other pressures around rent and rates, etc.? Do you have any responsibility in terms of supporting them to find ways to make their budget meet their requirements?
Well, we work very closely with our
Yeah.
arm's length bodies. We consider them to be delivery partners.
Yeah.
They have their own finance functions and their own accounting officers, so they would have the remit to make their own decisions within those guidelines, to be able to centre their budgetary needs as their allocations best fit towards delivery. We would work closely with them in terms of advice and support, but we don't have an obligation for them to live within their budgets. That would be a matter for the accounting officer themselves.
If they have, for example, statutory responsibilities that they have to deliver upon, like think about, for example, the Equality Commission, it's very clear in law their responsibilities in terms of monitoring. So what happens then whenever the cloth just keeps getting cut, in terms of how they actually meet their statutory requirements? Is that a
Would
point
be
that
part of the delivery partnership and oversight role. It wouldn't be specifically within finance. Finance would be part of it, but that would be part of the wider delivery.
Okay.
And we would have a close working relationship with them, and that's a position that we're very mindful of and would be raised frequently in terms of how close it comes.
Okay, thank you.
In terms of the pressures, they don't include the impact of the employer's national insurance increase, and we're working separately with the Department of Finance in that regard. Now, there were discussions ongoing with Treasury, but we have no idea at this moment in time whether anything would be forthcoming in terms of that funding. So that would be over and above the figures produced in terms of the paper, and we flagged that in the paper. It's essentially, until we knew that there was going to be an issue in terms of a pressure, it hasn't been factored in at this point. But we would keep the committee updated on that, as I think there was a note received yesterday in terms of that ongoing communication, as more information may be supplied to Department of Finance, that we would keep the committee sided on that.
Okay, thank you. Any questions before we go on? No? Okay, thank you.
In terms of question 7 was the staff costs, pressure of 1.18 million, and the question from the committee was whether the assumptions as advised by Department of Finance, being progression plus 3% uplift at the time, included a salary increment. So the assumptions applied in the calculations covered a 3% progression, but which would cover the increase within the scales. A further illustrative 1% was incorporated for that aspect, where staff would be entitled to an annual increment, which I believe was the question for the committee. So 3% uplift, but overall we would have impacted 4% in the calculation to allow for that.
Okay.
In terms of financial transactions capital, the question from the committee centred on £7.6 million of FTC loan repayment. More detail on the spend and what it includes. The 7.6 million figure actually relates to the receipts. So the loans that are in existence within the department's budgets are actually centering on the lead departments, being the Department of Finance and the Department for the Economy. So it's the loans administered to the Northern Ireland Investment Fund and to the universities. So there's no new loan funding factored into this. Those would be policy decisions and advised by those departments in year. What we've factored in terms of our calculations would be the interest required. So it's actually the cost element of the FTC requirement is 9.9 million, and that would centre on the interest running on the loans. The 7.6 million is the money coming back in, so there's a net figure of 2.3 million for which is our FTC bid. And I think the committee had asked separately in the letter yesterday whether we had put in and bid for any of the money that was available at the centre. And in essence, that's the money that we're bidding for at this moment in time. And we would be hopeful that that would be allocated at the start of the year.
Okay, thank you. Carol, do you have a question?
Yeah, it was just on the FTC. So it's loans to university. I'm sorry, where else? Didn't hear your last part.
The Northern Ireland Investment Fund.
Okay. And how much is left of a gap? So you're bidding for what, over £2 million?
£2.3 million, yeah, net.
Okay, and what that's to maintain the loans. What does that mean?
Interest is added to the loan on an annual basis based on the terms and conditions set in the contracts between the lead departments and the borrowers. So DFE will have loan agreements with each of the universities, and the Department of Finance has let a contract to CBRE, who administer the Northern Ireland Investment Fund.
And how much is spent on the body that's administering the investment fund?
That would be let within the contract. That CBRE are administering the investment fund, if I'm understanding the question correctly. This is, the loans are administered, if you like, out from government via SIB. So TEO will pass the funding to SIB, and we will make payments based on instruction from DFE and DOF. So the running costs, I take it that's what you mean in terms of CBRE. I don't have that level of detail with me.
So it's just that, I mean, I'm still confused about why the DFE loans and certainly the investment fund is calculated for through TO. So I don't understand that.
I was just going to give, if I could take a moment, the committee had asked for
yeah,
a high-level overview.
Finish my question. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but
Apologies.
it strikes me that we've got two bodies, SIB and CBRE, who are almost the in-between people. So how much is costing for their involvement in administering these funds?
Well, I don't have the costs, the running costs specifically in terms of CBRE. CBRE operate under a contract let directly by Department of Finance. So they have, via CPD, let a contract for the administration of FTC. It might be helpful for the committee to note the Department of Finance Permanent Secretary recently gave an update to the Finance Committee on FTC generally and specifically on the Northern Ireland Investment Fund. That might be helpful. But essentially this goes back, FTC was introduced in 2012-13 in order to boost investment. So it's intended to be used to stimulate private sector investment in infrastructure projects that benefit the region over and above the capital DEL that would be allocated by the executive. The funding is ring-fenced by Treasury and funds can only be used to provide a loan to or take an equity investment in a private sector entity. And the entity then used that money to invest in infrastructure. So in that context, DOF have let the contract to CBRE and they are managing that money on behalf of Department of Finance.
So, sorry, Chair, see if anyone's listening to this, all they're going to hear is SIB, CPD, CBRE and FTC. So I appreciate it might be a bit of head scratching at this point for people. So what I'm trying to ascertain is TO are responsible for SIB. Is that not right?
Yes. So the running cost, that's, if you like, incidental in terms of the administration.
No, sorry, are TO responsible for SIB?
For SIB,
okay.
yes.
So just to be clear, I would like to know what the running costs are for the Strategic Investment Board. Okay, that's one thing. I've asked for this before, by the way. And maybe it's a question that as a committee we can ask of the Finance Committee about the role of CBRE and CPD in administering these loans, because at the end of the day it's still public money. So we need to know how much the loans are and what the running costs of administering those loans are as well. So Charlie, that's my questions finished.
Thank you, Carol. Ryan?
Right, well, Carol probably covered it in more detail than I was planning to, but yeah, I mean, I would be interested in a proper briefing on financial transaction capital. I've asked for that before, just understanding it better, because I did wonder, as Carol did, why funding to the universities ends up coming through the TO budget. So
that's part of the overview that I was going to give. At the
Right.
start, whenever these loans were being put in place, Department of Finance and Department for the Economy don't have the legal authority to be able to administer the loans themselves. And DSO advice clarified that SIB has sufficiently wide remit to be able to administer the loans. So the temporary agreement in the meantime has been that the funding would be administered to the private sector via SIB, because they require, or they possess the legal various to be able to do that. So at the moment, for example, there's a financial provisions bill that is going through at the moment that is being progressed by Department of Finance. That will actually put the legislation in place to give those powers to Department of Finance and Department for the Economy. So the loans will transfer to those departments at that point. So this will move away. It's a temporary arrangement to allow the delivery of the FTC, because the FTC needs to be provided at arm's length through a private sector body. It can't be spent by public sector bodies. It's part of the conditions in terms of the Treasury stipulation around the loan funding.
Okay. Sorry, I've got to come in front. Timothy, first, go ahead.
Have you finished, Ronan, if there's more? Mine was more general.
All right, no.
So,
I'll bring Carol in, and then Sinead, go ahead, Carol, please.
So, Chair, I've asked before, what would Strategic Investment Board's costs for their involvement in the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy? Okay, I haven't received those costings. And how many employees involved in that strategy are with SIB rather than the different grades within the civil service under the TO department. So when we're looking for just clarification and figures, if that could be produced, please, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Sinead, please.
My question is, it was just kind of clarity again, Ronan, around the FTCs. My understanding is that we could be spending more of FTC money in order to drive some of the bigger projects that we might have here, only we don't have the frameworks that FTCs can work within, and so therefore there is money going back regularly, and yet we have a lack of money in the system, and yet FTC's money is not being used adequately. Can you speak?
Yeah, FTC, as I mentioned earlier on, it's very different from the normal capital dealt. So there are only specific circumstances in which it can be deployed. Because of those restrictions, with the exception of a couple of departments, DOF have indicated that it has been a challenge. Other departments that would be at the forefront in using the FTC at the moment, for example, would be communities in terms of the co-ownership, and also Invest NI, as well as the loans administered through ourselves. Detail on the operation of those loans, I would say, would rest with those departments. So in terms of the co-ownership, etc., I couldn't provide any detail on that. But moving forward, DOF are very clear that they will be looking to departments and constantly do discuss within monitoring rounds to seek opportunities for investment and using FTC, and it certainly does form part of where they're encouraging departments to look for the future in terms of the needs for the block in terms of funding capital projects.
Okay, you want to proceed? Thank you.
Okay. Ending violence against women and girls. The committee had asked what the department had done to ensure that there was involvement of groups at grassroots levels to encourage applications for the grant scheme. So current planned funding for the 24 to 26 EVOG grant schemes under the strategy are delivered in partnership with the councils, as you know, and they aim to take advantage of their on-the-ground knowledge and community need, because violence against women and girls, can happen anywhere, and to tackle it requires a whole of society response. 1.2 million has been allocated for a regional change fund to allow community and voluntary sector groups with expertise in ending violence against women and girls to deliver prevention-based programming to people in all communities all across our society. So in 24-25, 655,000 of momentum funding was given to councils to raise awareness of violence against women and girls and build the capacity of grassroots groups in order to be able to apply to the local change fund. And actions under that momentum funding that's being taken forward by the council include awareness raising events, toolkits to enable both community groups and relevant frontline professionals to engage with the work of prevention, including grassroots groups applying for the local change fund. £2 million has been allocated towards the local change fund to allow the groups in each of the council areas to apply for small grants, tiered at £5,000, £15,000 and £25,000 to support prevention work in partnership with the councils, and have encouraged awareness raising momentum activity to ensure that grassroots groups are able to apply for the money within the fund.
Okay. Go ahead, please, Timothy.
I suppose this relates both to the end of violence against women and girls and good relations. I'd raised this before in committee, where there seems to be this need within TEO where money becomes available, give it to councils. My question would be, how do we know that that's getting to the right people? Yes, you're maybe ticking a box for geographically it's going to 11 different areas in Northern Ireland, but once we hand that money over, how do we know we're getting the outcomes that the strategy demands, the change that's expected?
I think the answer to that would be that everything in terms of the delivery has been developed through the co-design process. So those delivery partners have been part of that process, and the department works closely with them in terms of all the delivery aspects, not only within the council, but in wider society in terms of the delivery of initiatives in terms of ending violence.
Does council approve the grants, or does TEO approve the grants?
I need to check that level of detail in terms of the process, the actual process for approvals.
I have a real concern that once again TEO washes their hands of the money. With this strategy, over to councils, you deliver what we're wanting without taking any day-to-day oversight. Like you take Mid and East Hampton for example, Ballymena, Carrickfergus and Larne. Is the money then spread out evenly over them areas? I don't understand. I'm not on the council anymore, so I don't understand how it is being spent in the community. Give you an example of, there's certain areas in Northern Ireland there's more of a problem with this than others. More high profile cases have taken place. Is councils getting the same award of money, or are we targeting areas where there is the problem is more widely known? I would like a more in-depth understanding of, with this money, to tackle this huge problem. How do we know we're getting the change and the societal change that we are really wanting?
I would say that colleagues within the department, it's not a case of passing over the money and gone. They're constantly involved in the delivery very, very closely. So I think probably in terms of the level of detail that you're looking, though, it would need to come from colleagues involved in delivery.
Could maybe look at
I would be keen in geographical spread even within the councils to ensure that the areas where need to be targeted are targeted. And if community groups are coming forward, and I'm not disputing the great work that community groups do on the ground, but is that the best way to target this problem? That's really my question.
I think what we'll do is maybe look to ask the Directorate to come back and give us an update in terms of some of the funds, some of the delivery in terms of strategic framework. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay.
Next, the committee had asked about the capital Del earmark funds in respect of truth recovery, and there was an accommodation cost figure in terms of the bid of 1.5 million. Now, that bid hasn't been met, but the committee had asked for a breakdown of the figure. It's back again to this aspect of, this is the capital element for the lease, but the leases would cover a period of time. So in terms of the accounting and budgeting rules, it all needs to be scored in year one. So no contractual relationships have been as yet entered into, and they would be subject to a separate business case process. So I should stress that from the outset. First of all, there's funding within the bid for accommodation capital costs for public inquiry of 0.6 million, but that would cover a period of up to 4 years. Now, we would hope it it wouldn't be required for that length of time. But we've factored in a marker bid to be able to have the funding to stand up the requirements as and when the legislation is through and decisions are made. All of this would be subject to legislation and decisions by ministers, and it would be based on the annual rent and service charge over that period. The public inquiry accommodation wouldn't just be like your normal office accommodation. There are very specific requirements that would be needed for such an inquiry, such as audio, visual and confidential rooms, etc., which stands to reason in terms of a public inquiry. Also, in terms of the redress service, the capital cost that's been factored in there in that bid was 0.75 million. Now, that's actually for a period of 10 years. Now, we'd hope that it would be less than that, but this is about a marker bid to put in the request for the resources to be able to deal with the requirements and to stand ready for the requirements of victims and survivors.
All right, just before you go on, and it might not be something you can answer today, but I appreciate the technical requirements for a public inquiry, but in the context of our financial constraints here in Northern Ireland, would it be your responsibility to make sure that options within the public estate, public department's estates could accommodate this, or does it have to be...
Any requirements being brought forward by departments would need to go to Department of Finance in the first consideration, and that would be with the view to seeing if there are options that could be accommodated within the estate.
Okay, so that does happen then?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that would be part of the business case process as well in terms of approvals. And I would highlight it's not all accommodation leases. That figure does include 170,000, which would be for website and portal costs. It's all wrapped up in that one figure, so it's not just purely accommodation.
Okay.
Okay. In terms of the earmarked resource DEL funds themselves, there was a bid figure for truth recovery of 51.6 million, and there was a request for a breakdown. Again, I would say, as I mentioned earlier on, this is all subject to decisions by ministers, and it is a marker bid to make sure that we are ready to meet the needs of victims. There's up to 43.4 million for estimated standardised payments, and scheme costs. Up to 3.2 million for initial costs of establishment and implementation of a public inquiry, including prony costs, and up to 2.1 million for core staff, being programme and inquiry secretariat, and 2.7 million for support services for VSS. But again, this is all a marker bid, subject to decisions yet to be made. In overall terms, the bids across all of the earmarked victims areas, just to recap on that, came to 168.8 million, and we got 150. So this was within the higher figure. It's not that this was a bid that was met. No contracts are signed, and it is to be ready to meet the needs during the year. Rights, language and identity. There was a question with regard to the £340,000 which had been allocated for 2024-25, so it's current year costs for the appointment process of the commissioners for the three bodies. And the question from the committee was whether the department would require this full amount this year, and if so, what was the breakdown? It was, as I say, the costs of the recruitment process, and ministers were pleased to announce the competitions which have launched within March. The other initial costs in respect to the three bodies were going to anticipate up to 8 posts, so that was the basis of the allocation. The competitions launched in March, and £52,000 has been forecast in the current year for advertising costs, and the remainder of the recruitment costs will fall into 2025-26.
I suppose, just before you go on, I suppose there was the concern again around the accommodation for the new office and then the two commissioners and stuff, and have you a role then in terms of advising that and going forward? That
would be similarly bid for in year and would be subject to business case and scrutiny. As I referred to earlier on, any leases or accommodation issues would all be brought to Department of Finance in the first instance to make best use of the estate.
But is there a public, is there an option for there to be transparency around that decision making, or is it just internal to the departments talking to each other?
We'd need to check the detail on that.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry, Timothy, do you want in on that one?
Yeah, so 52,000 spent so far, so there's about 290 left. Will that be carried over and included on the 25-26 figure?
We don't have an option automatically to be able to carry forward budgets, but we're discussing with Department of Finance what the requirement is for next
That
year.
would be in the opening baseline for next year, so they do have a budget of 340 as baseline budget next year.
8 posts, is that 4 staff each for the commissioners?
Don't have that detail with me in terms of the
Is
breakdown,
it
just the total figure.
4 full-time staff, 4 FTE? That's certainly something I'd like to know. So if there's 8 staff, is it 4 for each commissioner plus a commissioner? So next year the 1.56 for language, obviously that's not all we spend on languages in TEO, or is it?
Well, that was the bid, but the bid wasn't met. There's a baseline allocation for the opening during the year, and then bids would be brought forward as the process of recruitment progresses during the year, and the actual requirements become better shaped during the course of the year.
If the bid wasn't made, is there a thought process within the department that are you spending equal amounts on the 2 commissioner posts? So is there equal amount being allocated for Irish language and equal
I
amount?
don't have the bid broken down by body. I don't have the bid broken down by body.
Is that potentially information we could get?
I would try and get that for you.
We'll make a list at the end then, maybe of some further questions as well.
And then
Okay, the last one.
in terms of capital bids, the committee had asked what the bid of 580 million for, it's actually 580,000, sorry, for civil contingencies included, and the question was it an emergency fund or was it for specific programmes? It's specific programmes, it's not for an emergency fund.
Okay, thank you very much for all that. I suppose what, going forward and reflecting on some of the evidence we've taken this year, there have been questions around the 3 offices, the 3 international offices, with particular reference to Beijing. And I see in there was a bid for, I think, £140,000 for new office costs. I suppose we as a committee have been concerned at the lack of transparency around that work, where the office is, what they're doing, and how much money they're allocated each year. So I wonder, could you give me a breakdown of how much each of the 3 offices are set to receive or budgeted for in this next?
So that detail, it'd probably be easier to give a written detail brief
Okay.
to set all that out rather than go through numbers.
Okay. Anybody else got any questions, any further to the updates today or anything else on the papers? Go ahead.
If I could ask, go back to ending violence against women and girls, so any money that's been allocated, is that solely going to TEO or is there any money for justice within that strategy? I know it sits with TEO, but with the money that the department gets, is any of that split to focus through? I'm thinking primarily of policing resources to bolster.
Yeah, that would be a matter, I think, primarily within the DOJ budget. We don't transfer any of our allocation over to DOJ, for example, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, so any money that is spent in ending violence against women and girls is spent from the department essentially here. So DOJ don't spend any money on that of doing targeted initiatives.
I'm not familiar with the detail of the DOJ budget personally, but I mean, ending violence against women and girls actually in due course should actually be part of what all departments really spend, and should be embedded in terms of all delivery. But I appreciate the question in terms of justice, but that's detail that I wouldn't have.
Okay.
Just one more
Okay,
question
go ahead.
regarding staffing costs. You've explained what the money was sought for. Was there any bids made for additional staff to answer questions within the Executive Office?
No,
I'm looking at
not that I'm
that,
aware
and
of.
that we have had it released this week, that the tabled question, it took a year to produce the figures for the Washington trip last year. And I would certainly like more detail around. I've raised these concerns previously at committee of how slow the TEO are releasing figures, are releasing answers to questions, and I would like to get to the bottom of, is it a resourcing issue within the department? Is it officials sitting on answers, or is it the ministers themselves? That question turned up that there was 54,000 was spent in 4 days. Obviously this is very high level, some of the figures you're bringing before us, but 38,000 in travel. I'd like to know what sort of a pot we have in travel. For the ministers, that 38,000 can be spent for a 4-day junket to America.
We can maybe write some
I'll
of those
give
figures.
some of the questions at the end of committee. I understand you don't have the details in front of you, but I just wanted to air them concerns that I have of the feelings within TEO, and it relates to obviously staffing and getting information out of them.
Yeah.
We would say that the department takes its obligations under FOI very seriously and does make every effort to answer the questions. And in terms of assembly questions, we would make all efforts to answer as efficiently as possible.
You've highlighted the problem. To get the answer to that question, a journalist had to go through the information commissioner, whereas that's been tabled for months upon months. Raised it in the chamber with the First Minister, couldn't understand why the information
Timothy,
wasn't
this is not Ronan's fault.
why the information wasn't being provided, and then when the ICO told them to release the information, there it comes. MLA shouldn't have to go through the information commissioner to get answers.
Okay.
Appreciate it's not your department, but it's an opportunity to raise it.
You've made your point. Carol, please. I've got a question to finish off with. Go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, so Ronan, say in terms of the formula for money for ending violence against women and girls strategy going to local government, I am assuming it's done on a population basis rather than a geographical cut. It's just to be precise about the question, because I attended a few events organised by Belfast City Council in North Belfast, and I have to say they were excellent. They were truly grassroots, very vulnerable young women involved in them, and then one for older women. But it struck me that I don't know whose original question it was, maybe Timothy's, about does it go to local government as a cut? If you could just get that detail for us, it would be really helpful.
Okay. I just want to raise a concern I have in terms of how we're getting the information presented to us. I suppose in some ways I just feel like we're just getting really high level block figures against the sort of different directorates, for example, and I just wondered, is there any way that we can get more detail? I think Timothy's right, how much of it's spent within the department, how much of it actually goes out to the organisations, how much of it is on accommodation, etc. So I just think in terms of our scrutiny role, it would be important that the information we're given...
Certainly something to be very much willing to look at, and maybe we could engage with the clerk just to make sure that we're presenting it in as helpful a way as possible for the committee.
I'm not saying you're providing it unhelpfully on purpose, but I just think in terms of our understanding of how much of it is actually reaching the victims and survivors or the community organisations, I think that's probably where a lot of us are focused at the minute. Okay, we'll work with the clerk.
Just, can I ask Ronan a final question? So, do you believe that the budget position as you've outlined today are aligned to the programme for government priorities?
In terms of the allocations for next year, that's part of what all departments have to do now that we have the programme for government in place, is to align the budget to those priorities. Given that there are the 9 priorities, EVOGS is the standout one. There is a lot of our budget which would fall into other areas and doesn't have a headline because of the nature of the construct of the programme.
And that's similar for most departments.
Yeah.
But then violence against women and girls budget's not it's not big at all in the context of the department. So it might be a standout project, it might be a priority that is talked about a lot, but it's not where the money's been spent.
No, victims would, as we constantly raise.
I'm really asking you, will we be able to deliver on the programme for government and the targets that have been set based on the budget allocations that have now been made to. It's just that we don't want to get to the end of this or halfway through it and they say we couldn't deliver because we hadn't got the budget. So we're starting the process now. The budget has been aligned. Can we deliver our targets based on the allocations of the budget?
Well, certainly in terms of the largest part of the money that's been allocated to the department, that would be victims. And certainly the department feels that whilst it's not the full amount that was requested, that it's certainly a good starting point and that we should be in a position for the current year to be able to meet the needs of victims and survivors. It's demand-led and there is a statutory entitlement for all the victims. So certainly I would emphasise that the budget allocation doesn't take from the entitlement legislatively for those victims, and we would bring forward any additional requirements during the year to Department of Finance if they become available. In terms of ending violence against women and girls, the earmarked money that has been made available to the department does align with the strategy that has been published by ministers and that we're working with councils and grassroots groups to deliver. So certainly in that regard, that is sufficient to meet the needs.
So if we don't deliver, it's not because of money?
We could always do more is the other thing, I suppose, and I'm sure every department would say the same, but we could scale up if more money was available.
Okay. Can I just then clarify then, so do you believe that there's enough money within the budget to meet the statutory requirements of the Executive Office, and how much more over and above that do you have then in terms of not discretionary spend, but to allow for other programmes?
Well, the budget for the department is challenging. And it's not that there is headroom and spare capacity. And in fact, in terms of the pressures facing departments such as the employer's national insurance, that remains to be seen. That could present itself as an additional pressure. Okay. So in that regard, I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you today to say we've got enough money to do everything, because there's very likely additional pressures coming at us.
Okay, thank you. Carol, have you got last question there?
Sorry, it's just about your quality impact assessments, Chair. We had asked last week, Ronan, it's just in terms of the statutory obligations of the department, and even in your own answer to the Chair's question about statutory obligations, I'm assuming that the equality impact assessment, it says here an equality exercise commissioning note from Budget Sustainability Division requested that the department provide details. So was it a screening or was it a full equality impact assessment?
A screening has been done, and the screening will be published. There's a quarterly publication of all screening within the department that's published on the website. So it will be available on the website, but we can provide that to the committee.
Yeah, thank you, Ronan. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I think we've exhausted for today, but I really appreciate all your work and all your answers to both Ronan and Paula. Thank you. Members, we'll do a real quick update on recap on what we've agreed to send through by way of questions. Clark, can you please advise?
Yes,
please.
I hope. I'm going to just go around as to how they came up rather than bunching them together. So if you don't hear your question, please let me know. So just the first, if we start from the end and work backwards, so there was a request for the information on the equality exercise that came from Carol. Then we have Then we have the costs of the Strategic Investment Board role in relation to end of violence against women and girls, and the staffing figures, so the breakdown of those costs, and also the running costs of the CBRE and SIB in relation to financial transactions capital.
I think was it a broader question as well, Carol, in terms of SIB, for example?
So I understand Ronan's point. SIB are the private end that can spend the money, so that's British Treasury rules. I understand that in terms of the financial transactions capital. My question was actually quite specific about SIB staff were involved in developing the end and violence against women strategy. So it's the cost of that, and are those staff still seconded and paid for by SIB, or are they departmental officials now working on it?
Okay.
Yes, but I think earlier on as well, just to make sure I'm getting this right, we agreed that we'd write to DOF about the costs of CBRE and roll information about that running costs of CBRE and SIB in relation to financial transactions. Okay. And you're looking for a breakdown of rights, language and identity funding about staffing, if that's correct. So how would that, there was a figure of 8
posts,
8 posts, and to look for what detail there is about those 8 posts.
And is it 4 to each commissioner?
How it's worked out. Also agreed that you would look for generally to roll up a more detailed briefing from the officials in relation to ending violence against women and girls, specifically to look at the distribution. Yes, so the distribution, of the formula or approach used in funding. So what was the methodology that's used for distributing funding to councils and local groups as part of a wider detailed briefing about an update on the work that they're doing.
Geographical spread within the council.
Yeah. And
I had asked about the funding to the 3 international offices
yes,
as well.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry,
yes. So yes, you were looking for information about the overseas briefings, and we have scheduled a briefing, or sorry, the Overseas Bureau. So the costs and funding and oversight. So there is a briefing scheduled indicatively for the 7th of May.
But we useful to have the figures in advance of that.
In advance of that, yeah. In time for that meeting?
Yes.
That is my list.
Okay.
Can I just check with Sarah Ann if she has?
Yes, correct.
She
Just
has a couple.
one thing that I just added just was Mr. Gasson's point about the delay in the response to written questions.
Yes.
That we write about that as well.
I owe a paper on processes and timescales. I need to bring you back a paper on processes and
Another
timescales.
issue I'd raised was good relations, same ideas or same issue regarding ending violence against women and girls. So geographical spread, how's it broke down to councils? The money that TEO spends, so it seemed to be like a 50-50 split on the additional money that's going, just to ensure that we're getting to the right people and they're targeting the right areas. Another concern I would raise, so Ronan has said that there's no money for ending violence against women and girls transferred to any other department. So if this is to be a department priority for each of them, are they allocating money within their department?
It might be worth actually putting assembly questions into the different departments, because I know obviously justice, well,
it's a big thing for justice,
yeah,
but there's no money coming from TEO budget to help with that. So it'd be good to establish as each minister, so if it's a priority for the executive, how much is each minister allocating towards ending violence against women and girls?
Okay, so how have we decided to do that? Are we going to write to DOJ specifically and ask them what they're spending, or is this something that we would write to all
I think we could write to other, we
all
could write
committees?
I think so.
All the departments, sorry, I should say.
Also there's education and communities in there as well.
Sorry, there's one other thing.
Okay.
Sinead asked about Northwest Development Fund. Your question.
Just why they haven't allocated or match funded the Irish government's money, and they said it's under consideration at the moment. So I was asking what is the timescale for making a decision in and around that, because they are now at the end of this budgeting period, and there's a fear of them being left completely in limbo.
That was an action from last week.
Yes.
That letter was sent yesterday to the department.
So it went to the department. But we're getting non-answers from the department. Yeah. That's, it's under consideration. So we just need detail.
A final point, if possible, asked about the travel budget for the department.
Okay.
Sorry, before we go on,
Yes,
just to pick up. So some of these things I mean, there are questions here we probably won't get answers to in time to sign off a response to the Finance Committee. So if you're content, the expressions of concern that you've put in there, I'll express it as concern, and we'll follow it up with a question and say these are, and we can bring it back as draft, just so that you actually put down a marker that you're following these things up as part of this process, as well as asking the question that you would reflect it in the response to the Finance Committee, if you're content with that.
Okay, so if we can agree then for the clerk to draft the committee's response on the budget for 2025-26 for members' consideration at next week's meeting. Is that realistic timescale for the 2nd of April? And if you're content now, we will have a comfort break, 5-minute comfort break. Is that okay? Just go into closed session then. Okay, we'll resume in 5 minutes, members. So we're now broadcast. Members, we're going to move on to our next oral briefing from the department on the Communities in Transition programme. So I would refer you to pages 158 to 159 of your pack for the clerk's brief, pages 29 to 38 of the table pack for a departmental briefing paper, and this was also emailed to members on Monday of this week. So we have 2 members from the department here today to provide us with the briefing, and we have Ricky Irwin, Grade 5 Equality, Rights and Identity Director, and Carolyn Matta, Grade 7 in Communities and Transition. So you're both welcome, and apologies for the delay. As you can see, with quite a lot of questions in terms of the budget. I appreciate your patience, and if you'd like to go ahead and make your opening remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank everyone for the invitation to update the committee today. And we're conscious that this is the first opportunity for this committee to hear about the work delivered by Communities in Transition, which is part of the Executive's programme on paramilitarism and organised crime. Through the CIT element of the programme, TEO has been able to deliver a wide range of projects which have helped support communities facing the negative influences of paramilitarism, criminality and organised crime that still unfortunately exist in our communities today. CIT has worked to concentrate resources on those communities that continue to experience the biggest challenges emerging from our past. It focuses on building the resilience and capacity of people and groups to help reshape their neighbourhoods. It's been over 6 years since CIT was established as part of the wider Tackling Paramilitarism programme, so much has been achieved during this time, with the delivery of 83 projects totalling £23 million. In the last year alone, CIT projects have engaged many thousands of individuals across the 8 areas through numerous events, activities and interventions to support them in building community resilience. We've seen firsthand the valuable work which has been delivered and have gathered countless examples of good practice and delivery, some of which we've shared with you in the briefing paper today. For young people growing up in a post-conflict society, CIT has supported significant and long-term work to help many make better choices about their futures and to be more positively involved in their own communities. The CIT youth projects acknowledge the important role young people can play in our communities and point to alternative pathways by reducing the likelihood that they will become involved in risk-taking behaviours that are detrimental to their communities, their families and their own futures. It highlights to them the dangers of becoming victims of exploitation, whether criminal, sexual or monetary. For those who are experiencing mental health or addiction issues, we've been able to put in place support services in each of the 8 areas where community champions can reach out to those suffering and help them on a positive pathway to recovery. In some communities where paramilitary murals and images adorn gable walls and show a strong sense of paramilitary control, we've been able, through our delivery partners, to remove numerous contentious murals and re-image with alternatives, which really means something to the local community. When you take the totality of what's being delivered across the areas and the collaboration between projects and statutory bodies, it's clear CIT is making a significant difference to many people's lives, and the evidence supports this. From April 25, we intend to really focus on the key issues which negatively impact on our communities: mental health and addictions, raising the aspirations of young people, exploitation in its many forms, including community safety, and the impact of paramilitarism on the physical landscape. We'll also continue to provide support for ex-prisoner integration and restorative practice. So thank you for the opportunity today to present these remarks, and happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks very much for sending the paper in advance. I suppose the question that I would like to start off with is in relation to phase 3. I've raised this with you before and with the First and Deputy First Minister around the fact that South Belfast, for example, where we still see horrendous paramilitary coercive control in parts of inner South, obviously it's an area that's crying out for this sort of programme. What is happening with the research for scoping out the areas to be targeted within phase 3?
So just, I suppose, a bit of background. There are a lot of areas that have made representations around the prevalence of paramilitarism and that we would like to support. The 8 areas that were selected are based on research that was done in late 2016 and subsequently agreed by the Executive. Last year, the programme, which is run by the DOJ, carried out a review and indicated that there should be research to refresh the CIT areas. So that was an action for TEO. We have carried out research in partnership with Queen's University, and subject to funding, we would like to extend CIT reach into those other areas, and it would be subject to ministerial approval. Unfortunately, we didn't get the funding that we needed to be able to do that. In fact, we've got less funding next year than we have currently this year. So we are only able to focus in on the existing 8 areas going into the forthcoming year.
Okay. So I read through the best practice projects that you supplied, and I think that there's obviously some really, really good work that's happening in the different communities. But what struck me from them all was, no disrespect to the individuals or the individual organisations, but the first one there was around youth development, which is the responsibility of the Department of Education. The second one was around health and wellbeing, around addiction and mental health. That's the Department of Health. The next one was around employability and youth participation. Mm-hmm. So we know that there's Good Relations Fund, there's employability programs, there's Public Health Agency provides money. The only one that I thought really ticked the box for me was the London Dairy Culture and Identity Programme in terms of the... Is there a drift into other areas of responsibility for other departments?
I don't think so, Chair. I think we would all acknowledge that there's unmet need across all those sectors in terms of educational support, mental health support, employability. When you look at the purpose of CIT, it's about building resilience within communities. It's about targeting vulnerable individuals. It's about preventative work. It's also about targeted work where individuals have been affected by paramilitary influence. So those projects will have submitted proposals to us which have to demonstrate that they meet the objectives of the programme, and they have. I think we would all agree that if we had more money, we would continue to do more of that work, but there is no doubt that some of the work that we've got into now is in the fields of support services, which might be through health or whatever. The reality is that people who are being supported through CIT are often being supported a lot faster than they would be through the standard statutory routes. For example, mental health services, the waiting lists are exceptionally long. We have put contracts in place with some providers which are supported by the Department of Health, where we can get individuals seen a lot faster in a matter of weeks. So that shows the unique selling point, if you like, of CIT, the benefit, the added value of CIT. Of course, we'd like to be in a position where we didn't have to do any of that, but we're not in that position.
And that's all noble work, and I come from the community voluntary sector, and I certainly admire that, but how is that tackling paramilitary or activity and associated criminality? So, you have a very small budget, and is it being targeted at actually addressing the negative influence of paramilitary organisations?
So remember, CIT is only one small programme within the overall executive programme on paramilitarism and organised crime. So we were awarded 2.3 million this financial year. The overall programme has 16 million. There are many, many other components delivered by other departments which are funded through the programme. Also, the criminal justice and policing aspects are all funded through the programme as well. So we are just a small part of the overall approach. If you look at the recent Independent Reporting Commission report from February, it pretty much sets out quite clearly it's not just about a policing and criminal justice response. It needs to be a more holistic response, which also looks at deeply rooted socio-economic problems in deprived areas, which contribute to the influence of paramilitaries in those areas and coercive control, intimidation and so on. So our purpose in CIT is about the community work that's done in those local areas to build that level of resilience. So we are an important part of that overall programme, as are the other parts, and they all work together collectively to try and reduce the impact of paramilitarism.
Okay, so the last one just in relation to this. So we have neighbourhood renewal, we've got urban villages, we've got the North Belfast Strategic Good Relations Programme, we've got capacity building programmes within council. And so we've all these wee small, not some of them are quite large, but different pots of money. Is the Executive Office the best delivery body for this? Would it not be better even maybe given to councils or given to existing funding programmes like those delivered by the Department for Communities, as opposed to keep splitting the pot up and then the potential for duplication? Yeah. And let's face it, it can happen.
Yeah, I think many bodies have looked at that question. There have been reviews and evaluations, not least the IRC recently, and they have really confirmed that the CIT programme has been a model of good practice, being housed within TEO. There are many benefits, and in fact they have recommended that those lessons learned should be picked up by those other departments. So we have delivered many interventions in the spaces of health and education and employment, where over the course of the next 2 years, which is phase 3, our objective, I suppose, is to try and mainstream those within those other departments so that we're transferring that learning and that good practice is actually being picked up in the mainstream services.
Okay, I'll move on for now. Carol, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your just brief presentation. Just to say, in North Belfast, the youth provision around tackling paramilitaries and all that has been very effective. We've seen certainly influences, certainly in the New Lodge in 2019, where I couldn't tell you many so-called groups were trying to encourage young people to become involved in an unwanted bonfire. And it was the work of the youth providers afterwards, along with ourselves, that certainly made that difference. So I want to put that in the record. Ricky, see, in terms of, because there is a difference here, there are paramilitaries masquerading as whatever, but they're criminal gangs. So in terms of, like, for example, I've seen a lot of work undertaken by some of the ex-prisoner partners right across the constituency and further afield around pathways into employment, around conflict resolution. Can you speak about the importance of this work and set out, in your opinion, what more can be done? And I suppose following on from that, I mean, you did say that you put in for more money and you only got X amount. I'm assuming that bid will be live in the event that any slippage comes through monitoring rounds. That's my first question.
Okay, so the question about money, it's fair to say CIT's had a checker passed on this. So 23-24 we got 3.3 million from DOJ through the programme. This year, which ends on Monday coming, we only got 2.3 million, so we were £1 million down this year. Ministers could see the benefits of CIT and we presented the evidence, and TEO was able to secure 1.5 million through the June monitoring round this year, which allowed us to extend our contracts up to the 31st of March this year. Now, we have bid into the pot for the forthcoming year, 25-26, which starts next week. We put a bid in of over, well, actually it was around £5 million, so it was a significant increase, and it was to reflect Minister's desire to expand CIT into other areas. Unfortunately, we only got 2.9 million, which is nearly £1 million down on what we have this year. So we are in a position where we're going into a new phase. We need to look very critically at what works, what doesn't work. we've had significant learning over the course of 6 years where we have evolved the programme and looked at the learning and understood better the nature of paramilitarism and the community response and what works. We're moving into an issues-based approach for next year, which is looking at those 4 issues I mentioned at the start, Carol, around exploitation, youth, mental health, addictions and physical landscape. And we're doing that on the basis of evidence that we've gathered from communities, from the IRC, from the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, from academics and so on. So I think we plan to do the best that we can with the reduced funding that we have going into this year. But we will still bid in the monitoring rounds for additional funding, and in fact ministers have already said to me that they're supportive of that already for June monitoring. So as we did this year, I intend to bid in June again for more funds, and if we're successful, we'll discuss with ministers which areas they want us to go into, and that could include expanding existing CIT areas. So North Belfast is a prime example where it's mainly Ardown and New Lodge, but we know there's paramilitary activity in PUL areas beyond that we would like to support as well. So and there are other parts of Northern Ireland as well that we'd like to go into if we could, South Belfast for example. So it's all dependent on funding and what we can get during this year. Now phase 3 is supposed to be the final year of the entire executive programme, and Minister Long, DOJ, has gone to the executive in recent months and explained that before the end of that 2-year period there will be a further review of the programme to look at the lessons learned, and that will inform a future approach to tackling paramilitarism. So if you look at the IRC report, it's very clear. It says there needs to be a longer term approach here. Mm-hmm. When we get to March 27, it's not done. What that longer term approach, we don't know what that is yet. That might be around violence and harm reduction, a broader harm reduction type model. But our objective within TEO is to make sure that the good practice out of CIT is not lost, it's actually built on, and it's part of that model going forward.
Yeah, so Chair, my second question is, and you've partially answered it, Ricky, I mean, Communities on Transition, it was successful in Ardown, it was successful in New Lodge and continues to be, but the issue I have is that there are criminal gangs right across North Belfast, and that the people who are operating and working and administering the funds, if they're extended, their bona fides need to be checked, first of all. And then secondly, like if you take, for example, some of the racial attacks in South Belfast and even in parts of North, many of which had loyalist involvement according to the police. So I think it's crucial that Communities on Transition is extended to loyalist areas to tackle criminal gangs and paramilitaries and criminal gangs, because they're the same as far as I'm concerned. So you know, what maybe you can't answer it now, but what other areas other than those you've mentioned would you be minded to extend the CIT work to if you had the flexibility to do so? Thank you, Chair. That's me.
Yeah, Carol, I think the point about bona fides of organisations is obviously critical to any expansion plans, and we have strict governance procedures that we go through in terms of awarding contracts, and there are various frameworks and assurances that are sought before money is awarded. The areas I think would be subject to a ministerial conversation, and it's very much determined by how much money we get. So I think the more money we have, the more areas that we can go into. I wouldn't want to commit to what those areas would be right now, of course, because it is a ministerial decision, but we are aware of, I mean, I've been contacted, as is Carolyn, from other areas where they've said, how do we get access to CIT because we hear it's making a difference? And we always say we would love to work in those areas, but we just don't have the funding to do it. So that remains the position, unfortunately.
Okay, is that you, Carol? Yeah, okay, thank you. Anya, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you folks for coming in. And given us an update in relation to CAT. Ricky, just a quick one, and I know you touched on this answering Paula's previous question around some of the cross-cutting work that takes place. Could you detail, I suppose, the scope of any joint working or collaboration that is taking place?
Yeah, so, I mean, we are in the space of a number of other departments and statutory agencies, so we're not working in isolation. We have very good cooperation and collaboration in with the Education Authority, you know, DE, the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland, DOJ, DO Health, the Trust, the councils, the police and community safety partnerships. One of the things which has been a success of CIT is that before a proposal is confirmed, we ask the proposer to clarify what the need is. They need to evidence that, and then we within the CIT team would check that and verify that and do our own level of scrutiny to make sure that we're not duplicating anything which is going on in that area. So it's a process that we intend to carry forward into phase 3. We haven't awarded any contracts for next year yet, so it's important to say that. The tenders are currently out for most of them. It's a 3-week tender window. The tender panels will include independent people who maybe have health expertise or restorative practice or whatever it is. So we bring in other people to help us assess those applications to make sure that we're not duplicating, we're not displacing, and we're actually adding value in those areas.
And in terms of going forward, and I suppose I'm going to play devil's advocate here, but where is the room for possible improvement within CAT?
We can always be better, of course. I think what we have done is evolve quite well. So we've started to hone in on those particular issues. Exploitation has become quite a sharp issue, and I'm talking about monetary exploitation in terms of illegal money lending, child criminal exploitation, child sexual exploitation, unfortunately, anything in relation to drugs and abuse of young people. So we could probably always do better in that field, but what we are doing is making sure that we're working with the relevant lead statutory authorities, i.e. DOJ and DOH, who lead on exploitation action plans, to make sure that what we are doing is not harmful in any way in those areas. Other areas that we can do better, I'd have to think about that more, but you know, we're doing our best.
Oh, and I think you touched on I suppose a very valid point there, Ricky, just even around the terms of evolving with the times, I suppose being proactive rather than reactive when situations do occur. I suppose talking more broadly just around I suppose how the work of CAT has shaped overall strategic thinking. Could you maybe give your thoughts on that?
Because we're part of a bigger programme which is led by DOJ, I think we've benefited from the expertise and the resources that DOJ have brought to the table in terms of the research that they've carried out. So, for example, in February there was research around adverse childhood experiences, the impact of ACEs on the trauma of children and young people, and how that then makes them more vulnerable to paramilitary influence. I think we've benefited from having access to that research, and that has helped us shape our interventions going forward. There's been other research around gender-based violence and paramilitary links as well. So because we're part of that bigger system, we have also been able to feed in our learning from CIT in terms of the benefits of community-based support. Our own surveys have shown that communities have built their confidence around trusting the police, for example, this year, which has been great. Also, their understanding of the influence of paramilitaries in their area, and the surveys are showing that they think the influence is going down in that area, which is what we want. So when we see those positive impacts, we're feeding that back into the overall programme, and that's being disseminated across all the delivery partners and everyone that's involved, and it feeds into trying to understand what's driving paramilitarism, what's effective in terms of tackling it.
I suppose again that's important, that there is that holistic approach that's fed back into the centre, and there's learning for everyone involved. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. And Brian, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ricky and Carolyn, today and for your paper. I think you were in earlier, Ricky, so you've already addressed the issue about areas in North Belfast in particular that are missing out, and that is a sore issue, as you'll be aware, areas right along York Road, Shore Road. Is there any way of reaching out into those areas at the moment? I know you've your defined areas, but do you have any recognition of areas in need of support or any programs that they can tap into?
Yeah, so it's not like we have spare money, Brian, but we have in the past been able to use what's called an area of influence approach, which means that if there's certain activity, and I'll give Newton Ards as an example, last couple of years where there was some activity from South East Antrim UDA. Newton Ards is not a CIT area, but we were able to divert some resources from North Down, Bangor, through Northern Ireland Alternatives to support activity in the Newton Ards area. So we do have examples in the past. We've also been able to do it in Dungiven more recently, and we've used that area of influence badge, if you like, to be able to do that. I'd love to be able to do it everywhere, but we simply don't have the funding to do it in any meaningful way at this point.
Right. Well, obviously it's an issue that I and colleagues will continue to raise with the department. In terms of the funding contracts, is the funding tied up sort of then in annual contracts, or are there programs that are open to groups to apply, like for smaller pots, or is it all like more like an annual contract?
So it's timely now because we're about to end one financial year and enter another. So as I said earlier, we're in the process of tenders and the procurement. So CIT works, it's not a grant programme, it's a procurement programme, and we award contracts through tenders. So a lot of the tenders are currently out now. Organisations can register on the e-tender system, which is managed by DOF, and then they can submit their bids and they come to us and we assess them. Those contracts will then be awarded for a year, and they will be subject to a further year's extension if we get our funding for the second year of phase 3. There isn't a huge amount of scope in year to support things, but the way we have it set up is that we will be asking those bidders to set out a work plan for the year, and we will want them to demonstrate how they're going to meet the objectives of whatever it is, mental health and addictions or youth or whatever. And where we think there's potential, we'll obviously score those, but where during the year, if we think they should be tweaking their delivery in some way or reflecting emerging needs in one area which they didn't know at the time, we will ask them to look at that. So we don't have a huge amount of flexibility once the contracts are awarded, but we do have some. But there isn't an ongoing pot of money, if you like.
Right. Last question, Chair. Yep. In terms of capacity building, and how the approach has changed over time, either in the past or now, is the focus on, do you say, groups in transition, or whenever you say communities in transition, are you talking about, to use the term, former combatants, or are you talking about the wider community? In the past, people would have almost described or said, is this good behaviour money, or is this for the wider community, areas where there is the need for a wider capacity building and building up community structures? How do you ensure that, as I say, where would you say the focus, and has that focus changed over time?
I think at the start the focus was capacity building itself, but it was capacity building for individuals and communities. Phase 2 of CIT moved more into building resilience, but building resilience of the communities and the areas. That also included individuals and providing individuals with opportunities and skills. So we have a range of metrics that we measure the projects against. Some of them are based on individuals, some of them are based on groups, and some of them based on the wider community. So it's a whole spectrum there. We do support obviously ex-prisoner integration. It's one of the key regional projects that we support, and Again, that's been very successful. There have been huge numbers of ex-prisoner families have come through that process. And there's a particular set of challenges that ex-prisoners face. And we've supported activity everywhere on that. We've also done some regional work on restorative practice. So it would happen across all 8 areas and be done through Northern Ireland Alternatives and Community Restorative Justice Ireland. So again, we're looking to build on those going into phase 3. So we're not funding, we're funding groups that are bona fide voluntary community organisations, registered charities. We have a very strict behaviours framework. If anyone breaches the behaviours framework, and it's really based around 2 key principles: upholding the rule of law, and secondly, respecting democracy and not being involved in criminal activity. So if we suspect or we hear that there is anyone who's breached the behaviours framework, we will suspend funding, and that has happened in the past.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Timothy, please.
Thanks, Chair. I suppose what I'm hearing today has changed my mindset of what the funding is, communities in transition. It seems to be very much, this could be a DFC project, it could be a Department of Health project, but it sits within TEO. I was under the impression it was more paramilitary focused, whereas when you were going through your list, I think you had addictions and different things before you got to paramilitary. But just picking up on the 18 organisations that had contracts last year, totaling 3.78 million. Mm-hmm. How do you work out what each organisation gets? Like from the figures I have from last year, the least amount awarded to one of the groups was 29k, and the most awarded to one of the groups was 1.1 million. Mm-hmm. How do you assess that and assign each group an allocation of money to provide that service?
So this current year, which is coming to an end, 3.8 million, it was originally 2.3 million, and all the contracts were going to end in December. Those contracts were based on previous tender processes where we had put out invitations to tender and said we are looking for organisations to deliver, and then it was more themes, so it might have been culture and identity or personal transition. Those amounts were determined by assessing those tenders at that time. Then we got 1.5 million this year, which allowed us to extend those contracts up to the end of the financial year, which is Monday coming. So naturally, the amounts awarded to all organisations are different because the needs in each of the areas, according to the themes, were different. It was never going to be the same amount, the same organisation or different organisations for the same thing. And it will be different again going into the new financial year. We have 2.9 million, the tenders are out at the minute. The bidders will have to demonstrate what is the need for that particular intervention in that particular area. We will have to assess that with the help of other agencies and departments, and then we will award the contracts accordingly. So I fully expect there to be a broad range of amounts, again, across the delivery partners.
Back to the 8 geographical areas, that's based on 2016 data.
Yes.
At what point does a community and transition become a community transitioned?
Well, that's a much bigger question which the programme itself has been grappling with. The Independent Reporting Commission has said there needs to be a much longer term approach to tackling paramilitarism. It won't be solved by March 2027, but there will still be a need for criminal justice and policing response alongside a community-based response which is trying to tackle the socio-economic issues, which is part of what CIT is doing. So if you're looking for metrics in terms of saying there's no more paramilitarism, then you need to look at the metrics for the entire programme. So one of those would be no more recruitment of paramilitaries, ending paramilitary activity, people feel safe in their communities. They're all constantly being measured and they're going in the right direction. We can demonstrate, for example, that paramilitary assaults, shootings and attacks have gone down steadily since the programme commenced.
In these 8 areas?
In these 8 areas.
But meanwhile you have Northampton where there's been a significant increase in the paramilitary crime task force being in the area, and there's no money has went there. You're still looking at data from 2016.
And remember that CIT is just limited to those 8 areas, but other parts of the programme, of which there's much more money, like the Paramilitary Crime Task Force, will be working everywhere. So they will be looking at the organised crime gangs, the large paramilitary gangs, and saying, where are they operating? So they're not limited to the 8 CIT areas, so there is ongoing work elsewhere.
At the same time, is there not an expectation where after the Paramilitary Crime Task Force has been in an area, you then come in with money to try and transition that community? Because that's live data of where there is, activity there now. Like, give you an example: Ballymoney, Dervick, Moss Side, Bushmills. Like, there's communities there. The community groups have came together, come and met me, crying out for money to try and get something for the young people to do, youth projects, and I thought this is the perfect programme for them, and that's one of the reasons why I was pushing to bring you here. But like, it appears that's not even on your radar. Essentially, that's not one of your focuses, because you're delving into health, you're delving into addiction, and that exists all over Northern Ireland. But when you're doing that, you're not following the communities that are trying to transition.
I would disagree, Timothy, because we are conscious of the other areas where there's paramilitary activity, and we would really like to try and get into those areas. If we got into new areas, I think what we would do is we would work with the community infrastructure and the statutory agencies to understand what the need is in those areas, and then design the interventions accordingly. So they would be tailored to the specific issues in Northampton, for example. I simply don't have the money to be able to do that. What we're doing now has been confirmed that it's actually making a difference towards the overall tackling paramilitarism programme. So the young people, for example, that we work with either have been impacted directly by paramilitaries because they've been exploited, they've been used for drug dealing, whatever, or they are at risk of falling into the hands of paramilitaries. So yes, while it might be youth work or it might be work through restorative practice in schools, which sits elsewhere, it is actually contributing to the overall objective of reducing paramilitarism.
So these 8 areas, many of them have transitioned.
What is transitioning though? That's not an answer that I can give.
Well, is it a case then these areas forever and a day while this programme runs, these will be the areas you're focusing on?
I think that's a question for the overall programme. We're just a small part of it, and we have been given funding to continue for a further 2 years, and that's what we will do. And we can show the benefits and the evidence that has made it better for those areas, those community groups and the individuals involved.
So the 3 phases, have they all concentrated in these 8 areas?
Yes.
Sorry, could I just come in very quickly? So whenever the Deputy First Minister was here last autumn, I asked her, was the research, had it been commissioned for the scoping exercise for phase 3, and she said it was about to happen. So if you could speak to that.
Would that not indicate that they were looking at other areas?
Well, no, I mean, sorry, maybe I
So
wasn't,
maybe I wasn't
clear
coming.
earlier. We have the research.
What does it
I
tell you
made
about
the bid.
Northampton?
I made the bid for £5 million. We got 2.9. The bid was based on expanding into other areas. We didn't get the money, so I can't, unless I get more money, we can't expand. The actual areas that we go into will be a matter for ministers to determine.
You had mentioned ministerial conversations. Surely there's a priority list that it shouldn't be a minister saying, right, I have money, or we can get you more money, go into this area. Surely there must be a matrix to say, based on the crime, the paramilitary task force, this is an area which ranks in, that you have to go to next. You have to show a focus in, you have to invest in, you have to build community groups.
Yes.
I'm not getting that.
No, that's there. That's there. So the research was done by Queen's University. They looked at the methodology that was done in 2016-17. They have tried to replicate the methodology as best they can based on the range of data sets that are available from the various authorities, not just the PSNI but also Housing Executive, in terms of intimidations out of houses, community restorative justice organisations who have individuals who are under threat, for example. There are a range of data sources. So the researchers have used all that data.
When was the latest data, did you say?
Over the course of the last few months. I think we got it in
September 2024.
Yeah.
Can you share that with the committee?
I can take that request back, certainly.
And finally, if there's any of the other areas rank higher than the areas you prioritised, they still don't get a look in, is that right?
Well, the 8 areas are still in the list, but like I say, expansion could occur within some of the 8 areas, so that's also a consideration. So, for example, Carrick and Larne, the research shows that actually the broader South Antrim area, bringing in Antrim, parts of Newton Abbey, Rathcoole, for example, Monkstown.
Up as far as Ballyclare.
So, in theory, that would be an expansion of the Carrick and Larne CIT area. So there's quite a lot of consideration and decisions that would need to be made about how expansion would occur and then how much that would cost. But, yeah.
So you had mentioned areas of influence, that approach you're taking. So my constituents in North Antrim would love to sit down and talk to yourselves about the need that's there. Is that something you are willing to do?
I've had conversations with individuals from North Antrim. They've made representations to us, and we're very sympathetic, of course, but we don't have the money at this stage. If we're able to divert resources to other parts, we will aim to do that, but right now we don't have the resources to do that.
Will you meet them?
I'm happy to meet anyone about this issue, of course, absolutely. I mean, the reality is we're nearly £1 million down going into the next financial year. So we can't even do what we've been doing this year in the existing 8 areas, never mind new areas.
Okay. I'm very concerned by what we've just heard. So research has been commissioned through the public purse that's demonstrated where the structures are, where the need is at the minute, and yet this year by year, I appreciate there's the potential for a year's extension, is continuing to be awarded to areas that maybe in an independent, academically produced research would demonstrate that that's not the areas that most need it. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not
Well,
what
if
I'm
you
saying.
if you could give us the report so that we could see that for ourselves, that would be appreciated.
I can take that request back, Chair, yeah.
Go ahead, Sinead.
My question is really following on for that. I'm kind of sitting here with my mouth open, but I wanted to see if you could provide data on the difference in our attitudes to paramilitarism in the past 6 years to see communities in transition has been run out. And then you're saying that you have data and you have evidence and all of that, but you're not bringing it to the committee to see. So it's very hard to kind of interrogate data that we're not allowed to see. And you need the question.
For it, to be fair,
well,
but
it's not about asking. You're coming here to talk about a programme that the public purse has been paying for, and it's in the region of millions and millions of pounds in the past 6 years. So we're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of it. We're trying to evaluate the cost effectiveness and the analysis of where it is actually helping to support that transition, and we can only do that through evidence. And it's not subjective, it's evidence and it's data, and that's what we're trying to interrogate. And I think again, Timothy said it, when does transition happen? I suppose the most difficult and challenging part of all of this is communities in transition. When do we know that it's worked? And you're saying we won't because it goes on forever. A long time, a long period.
I'm
and these eight areas, none of them have transitioned yet. So, but you've got evidential data to say that they're moving in the right direction. It's just that it's not been shared with us. But can you provide one example? For example, when funding has been allocated to a CIT project, but then revised possibly that funding on the basis that it wasn't meeting its objectives, and how did you intervene there in order to ensure that the money that was allocated to them would be used in an effective and proper manner? Can you give me evidence of one?
Where we've changed, can you think of?
Can I just talk a bit about the move from a thematic approach to an issues-based approach, Sinead, which will probably capture what you're getting at. Take, for example, the Community Safety Project, which we had in 7 of the 8 CIT areas. there was a lot of work going on around general community safety responses in the area and building relationships with the PSNI, which has been successful. We last year, or in the current year that we're in, the transition year, made a deliberate move to looking at exploitation, so monetary, child criminal and sexual exploitation. So that was a shift from us. It was us changing from a thematic approach to an issues-based approach to focus our budget in a more targeted way. And we have seen how that has really, really worked, how we're getting better results through, we talk about evidence that things are working. Come the 31st of March, we will have a full bank of data from this year on entry and exit surveys, which will show attitudinal change across the programme. So rather than refer to one specific thing that CIT has done, that has been our move this year. Through health and wellbeing, we've moved to mental health and addictions. The culture and identity, we're moving to the impact of paramilitarism on the physical landscape. So we have, as our budget has reduced, we have tried to squeeze our programmes to be more focused on the core issues that we know are the big issues in community.
Yeah.
So that has been our move.
Are they been augmented by other areas of funding that are going into that? For example, I know in my constituency, CIT funding as well as the Department of Health funding are going towards trying to reverse health inequalities. And I think that there's so many health inequalities in the Foyle constituency, and that is very much required. But does it transition communities out of paramilitarism? I'm not quite sure. So is it the time for maybe the name of the funding pot to be actually changed? That's not about transitioning from paramilitary. It's about building resilient communities, and where that takes us. Because I quite often hear from constituents saying transition. We're 27 years after the peace agreement. These people weren't even born. Some of the people that are involved in paramilitary activity during the Troubles, as we call it. So they've been caught up in criminal and antisocial behaviour within their communities. A lot of it is from living in poverty. And living in focus because of the circumstances in which they find themselves. So there's a frustration, and can you understand, there is a frustration and some really big misconceptions about, communities in transition, not about the work and the good work that has taken place in communities, by communities, but about the fact is they see paramilitary activity, and I'm using the inverted commas here, but just criminal gangs operating against their community. And, there's a deep frustration in that. And I think that that's what we're hearing here. And I suppose the 8 areas that, it's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
It's happening everywhere. And if there's money been, from the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and, others trying to tackle these issues, they're not dissimilar. But in many ways, the communities are working in silos because that is how the funding makes them work, because they're answering to various different departments, and they're equally frustrated about trying to deal with, health issues or mental health or blah, 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 and yet they're getting a wee pocket here and pocket there and constantly trying to chase the last pound. And, I spoke to people from the Old Library Trust last week when I was doing a constituency clinic in Craigan. And, they're waiting for funding. They're desperately waiting because it's people's jobs. So it's not a criticism about the work, it's the criticism about how we structure all of this and the responsibility for it.
And I would agree with all of that. And I think the question is about how we affect that systemic change, so that we're changing the wider system. And again, the IRC report has picked up on this and said other department strategies, be it RAISE in education or neighbourhood renewal, need to be mindful of the need to tackle paramilitarism as well. It can't just be about TEO and DOJ and the money that we have. It needs to be about the anti-poverty strategy, about lots of other different things coming together. So we do our best to try and influence those other departments in what they're doing based on what we think works. But there's a much bigger question around systemic change there.
Okay, I'm really, really conscious of time. We're probably about an hour behind here. Claire, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose it's really just building on what everyone else has said. I was the minister in charge at the time in which we brought the Paramilitaries Action Plan, and I've always maintained that it was never going to be successful in the absence of a programme for government, an effective programme for government which looks at all the areas that you've highlighted in relation to socio-economic issues. Because ultimately I think that's what this is. It's a crisis in how we deal with our communities who are vulnerable, and they're vulnerable because of the failures of government to not address socio-economic issues. And you know, how do we do that then? You know, because certainly as the executive office, how do we get that message across? I think it's what Sinead's saying. I think it's what everyone's saying, to be quite honest. You know, we nearly need to, you know, is it even in the current programme for government as an overarching look within each department? Are we being specific about that?
I think there are 2 or 3 references to reaffirm the commitment to tackle paramilitarism in the current programme for government. There's also a commitment to refresh the Communities in Transition programme, which is the phase 3. So there are references in there, yes.
Yeah, but it's references, and it's not really going into the specifics in relation to what you've talked about, and recognising that this actually is a responsibility for communities, for health, for even roads, you know.
Yes.
Because if you go into an area in North Belfast and they're using a peace wall as currency for the fact that they have potholes, you know, that's one of the biggest, you know, kind of issues in relation to this. And I suppose maybe my question around this as well is, how do we encourage the communities to recognise what's happening? Because ultimately these individuals are exploiting their vulnerabilities, and they're exploiting them because the government, and I suppose give confidence back to these communities that the government, who should be providing all of these services, are not. You know, because that's the big issue here, and that's why they're turning to paramilitaries. And I think we have to also recognise that paramilitaries are not guys in balaclavas. They're their neighbours, they're their friends, they're their family members. So how do we break that connection so that the communities themselves are not so dependent on these individuals? I think it starts with government. And certainly if there's a message I could send back to our First and Deputy First Minister and the wider executive is recognise that actually it's the failure to actually give communities what they're entitled to that is leading them to this alternative. But then how do we help them recognise this? Because this is coercive control, and they don't see it.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's been a question that the programme itself has grappled with, and the End in the Harm campaign, of course, is designed to try and raise awareness. We've all seen the adverts and the billboards to outline the level of coercive control that it can be, and the different forms, I think, that it takes, and the fact that it can be your neighbours. It also highlights the fact that paramilitarism has shifted significantly over the years and has moved more into the likes of illegal money lending, for example. So there's been a lot of work done to try and raise awareness around those issues. I think a lot more could be done, and we need to be a lot more joined up across government and be mindful that we need to look through the lens of paramilitarism whenever we're looking at our strategies around community safety or raising educational aspiration, for example. You know, how will this also tackle reducing the space, I think, that paramilitaries can operate in is where we need to get to, and try and eliminate that completely. Yeah.
I think the point around helping the communities recognise it, because you know, I appreciate you're saying that some people are saying they are feeling safer.
Yes.
I would nearly challenge that a little bit in respect of it's because they feel that they're being kept safe, and not by government or the statutory agencies. They feel they're safe because of people within their communities. So how do we help them recognise this coercive control, this manipulation? Because, you know, if we're going to call it out for what it is, it's financial exploitation, it's child sexual exploitation, which is actually quite horrific, and if people really realise what was going on in their communities, they might have a different view on these things. And it is, I've lost my train of thought, drugs.
A lot of it's drugs driven, yeah. I mean, I think the End in the Harm campaign, the messages have been fairly hard-hitting around children being abused, for example, by paramilitaries. So I think the messages need to continue to be hard-hitting, and I think alongside that, we need to work with all the statutory agencies and community groups to raise that awareness, because a lot of these harms are hidden at the end of the day. We probably need more research on this issue, and it's been helpful that we've had research around adverse childhood experiences and the impact that trauma has on the vulnerability of children and young people growing up, the gender-based aspect as well. So we should continue with trying to understand what the problem is, and then that helps us design the interventions. So that's why this is a longer term thing, and it's a much more societal issue. It's not just a TEO and DOJ issue, it's for all of us.
Last point.
Okay, quickly, because we're...
I suppose it's just to express similar frustrations as Timothy and others have had around going outside of those 8 areas, and I appreciate your limitations in respect of that. And you know, whilst you're looking at it almost on a macro perspective to try and, you know, 80% of the picture, 20%, and you know, these figures are entirely made up, but it's those areas that stop the confidence, you know, in this being tackled. And we need to, as an executive, find a way to look at all of those areas rather than just trying to tick off as much as we can in terms of the statistics around it. I know you're not necessarily doing that, and I appreciate you are constrained. However, you know, what Timothy's saying in relation to North Antrim, and then even how that comes into my own constituency, is really very serious. And yeah. You know, I think I think the executive have to start recognising that we can't just tick off 7 areas and that's enough, we're done. Yeah. You know, and as social economic issues get worse, this is going to get worse. So it's really just a takeaway in relation to those frustrations.
Yep. Oh, okay. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, Harry, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. And Ricky, just mentioned 23 million and 6 years, and you mentioned long term and some short term workages we're doing. What do you think's the best value or creates the best outcome, the long term or the short term projects?
It's an interesting question, Harry. It depends on the intervention. I think in the short term, when an individual hasn't been able to get access to essential mental health support, for example, because they may be suicidal or under threat from paramilitaries, and we're able to support organisations to support that individual and remove that threat, I think the short-term benefits are obviously immeasurable for that person. I think in terms of the longer term, obviously it's around increased confidence in policing. It's the bigger benefits that I'm talking about in terms of feeling safe within your community, feeling that the paramilitaries don't have influence in your area. They're equally as important because that's the population change that we're trying to achieve. So it's a difficult question to answer, but I think both short term and long term very important. Yeah. Depends on the nature of the intervention.
That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricky and Carolyn. I really appreciate that. I think what we'll do is we'll ask the clerk to sort of send a summary of actions afterwards, as opposed to recapping them now. Apologies to our third panel. If you would like to come forward, our third panel of the day. Members, let me just get my notes. So we're going to receive an oral briefing from Join the Dots Together on the subject of peace and reconciliation. Members, you'll find the clerk's briefing page 161 to 62, and then you'll find the briefing just after that. So,
Chair,
yeah.
Let me speak to you. My name is Cheryl Mabon. I'm the Presbyterian chaplain at Ulster University. I wasn't going to be doing this. Our main mover in this committee is Juanita Majura, who's behind me, who's lost her mother yesterday, but is still here with us today because she cares so much about this. But we didn't think it was fair to put her in the hot seat today.
So sympathy to you.
This is Father Jerry, who's my colleague in Ulster University and the director of the Jesuit Centre in Belfast.
Yes.
And this is Edwin Graham from the Northern Ireland Interfaith Forum, where we have many of our meetings. Behind me I also have Ed Peterson from Clonard, who's also a member of the steering committee. Wasn't sure quite what the best way to tell you this story is. I'm going to tell it from my perspective. I'm a chaplain. We meet lots of international students. Many of them come from very hot countries. Many of them are working in industries or working on studies to try and alleviate climate change because they in their home countries see the damage that's going on. If the air conditioning breaks down, 50-degree heat, people are dying in the streets. They know that there may not be a long-term solution for them staying where they are. They're coming here. They're looking for visas to study, but many of them are looking for visas to stay and work because it's a lifeboat nation. This is an island that has, for the moment, a prospect of giving them a future that they might not have at home. So it's not just for economic reasons that they come, it's also because of climate change, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. So I walked into Father Jerry's office one day in the Jesuit Centre where they kindly give me parking, and we've been working together on an Anglican programme called The Difference, where we're trying to learn to be present, be curious, reimagine together, to learn about encountering people who are different from us in a way that's constructive. And one of the students that came along to that programme is a Nigerian student studying peace and conflict. And in his manual, there's a whole chapter on climate. Peace and conflict is massively a climate justice issue, and it's affecting us here on many levels. So I walked into Father Jerry's office and met some of the others from the committee who were sitting around saying, what are we going to do? Most of them were Catholics, and I said, do you know Protestants care about this as well? So we began to talk about who was caring about these things and what could be done. And we had a conference in January 2024, so from a standing start in the autumn of 2023, and any climate events I'd been at before, there were always only a handful of people attended. But on that event, we had, the room was filled in Ulster University, and I think there were 60 people in the room, and there were 100, okay, or maybe it was 60 organisations. I don't. So forgive me. I was busy looking after lots of practical things that day. So we realised that doing stuff together was encouraging to the people that are trying to address this big issue. It's like we're all paddling in this little boat, and while we're fighting about the kind of conflict that you've just been discussing around, who owns this piece of land and battling each other with the oars, there's a big monster of climate change that's going to just swallow the whole boat. And we have this question of how do we, as we share this little boat, address the big issue that's coming for all of us. And so that was encouraging for the people in the different organisations, and their big ask was that we find out what each other are doing and work together more. So we thought the only way to do that was to have a calendar where people could put their events. Interestingly, that hasn't been the thing that has worked particularly well so far, so we probably need more manpower to push it and to make that something that all the different organisations busily doing their bit can inform each other and coordinate. But we have found that because we've begun to work together, we are learning from the people that we're offering things to. So one of the big events we had last September for the International Day of Peace, we tagged on to Corey Mila, who had invited over Martin Palmer from Faith Invest. So big questions of international financial infrastructure, but we had a youth event with schools, and some of the passion coming from the young people across the board, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, but they get the need for there to be climate justice and for us to act. And they're crying out for that, and we've got a nice little quote about that in your
thank you. Paper.
Lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that?
I suppose.
Edwin, come on. Yeah, or ask us your question. What do you want to know?
Okay. I suppose we are the scrutiny committee for the executive office, and as you've heard there, we have responsibility for social justice, good relations, shared future. So it's really about. Obviously, you have come together around the theme of climate emergency, but I suppose we're interested as a committee around how that's then impacted in terms of the reconciliation piece and breaking down barriers. So if you could maybe speak to the good practice that you've found through that.
Want to carry on?
Yeah, if I can pick up. So for me, the really striking thing has been the way in which, with a common focus, in this case the focus has been on climate justice, but because of that common focus, we've been able to bring together a very diverse range of different groups. So my faith background is Baha'i. At the conference that we had last September, we had Dr. Raja Haran, who's a retired plant scientist, but speaking from an Islamic perspective on a Muslim document called Al-Mizan, which sets out Muslim views in relation to climate change. Very similar, like you'll be familiar with Laudato Si maybe, which is the Pope's encyclical on the environment. Al-Mizan is a similar document to Laudato Si. So really, what really strikes me is the way in which, as I say, very diverse faith communities have been enabled to come together and build an understanding of each other, which is really quite unique. Yeah.
And I suppose if you could speak to maybe some of the work you've done in terms of bringing school children together and, you know, the youth, is there some lessons to be learned from that as well?
There's a publication that I think we circulated. It's called Faith Initiative, and I'm not sure which page number. It might be page 12.
Okay.
It captures there are some photographs in that of the youth event when the children came together.
Right.
So it was a really powerful event that we did in Queen's again last September, bringing young people together. The title was Our Voices Matter was the title. Martin Palmer spoke at it, Professor John Barry spoke, and then the young people from different schools were separated, and around each table there was a mixture of pupils from different schools. Each table produced a list of points that they wanted to raise with politicians, and with two politicians who attended. We were actually very keen that we had more, but we had two. And one of the messages that we would give to you today is it can be incredibly empowering for young people whenever they can get the ear of a politician. Mm-hmm. And you all have incredibly busy diaries, but if you can make the space to listen to young folk, yeah. The messages that they were coming forward with were incredibly powerful. So there was one particular that we've quoted. One young person said, "It opened my mind not only to the idea of faith being integral to the environmental mission, but also the idea that faith can be a strong uniting force, not just a dividing one, which is a hard lesson to learn in Northern Ireland." And it was just so powerful to see the way in which young people were responding, and also that the commonalities across faith communities and across very diverse faith communities, that those commonalities were coming to the fore, and the divisions were slipping away.
So I guess what we were hoping we'd be able to encourage you to find ways to fund or whatever it is you do, is to not always fall into what we perceive as parcelling out money into this group and that group, but encouraging people to think about the big issues that affect us all and find ways to bring people together on the big stuff, because they will find their common humanity in that. They will also find their differences, but they also will find ways to hold those differences together in proportion, and realising that, yes, okay, well, we might want to fight about this, but actually we have to do that first.
Yeah. I suppose we're waiting for the launch or the publication of the review into the TBUC programme, the Together Building United Communities. And we've been given an assurance from the ministers that they will be looking at it in its broadest sense, not just the binary communities, but also then the whole spectrum across different ethnicities and stuff. So I suppose this will be informing us in terms of the next phase around how we look at good relations in its broadest sense. And again, you know, where people can come together around a common theme that doesn't feel as blunt as sectarianism or racism, but, you know, people look around. So I suppose that it's really just trying to glean some of the learning from that sort of people coming together. Do you want go ahead, please?
Just a quick one from myself, Chair. Sorry. I suppose it's in and around funding. Do you get any government funding at all? Or what way does your funding work?
So the Join the Dots Together initiative is an ad hoc group and doesn't have any structure. It came together very quickly and did an amazing programme in September last year. In order to facilitate that, a number of us came together from different organisations, and the Northern Ireland Interfaith Forum, because it's a registered charity, was able to apply on behalf of the Join the Dots Together initiative to the Community Relations Council. We got £1,500, and that paid for an amazing number of activities last September. Like there were, I think, about 6 or 8 different events. So it was pennies really in terms of, like, we reckon the actual cost of the programme that we ran was closer to £5,000, and we had £1,500 to pay for it. So everybody dipped into their pockets, everybody made it work, everybody gave time voluntarily. So if you know of anybody that can give us some money, we would love to know.
Well, I suppose that's, look, our role as a definitely as a committee. Obviously, we have a scrutiny role, but also to I suppose highlight voices like yourselves, and anything we could do to highlight that, we definitely would.
Harry, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair. You had said about sharing a little boat, sounds interesting. And then you said about attending a conference, and people were asking you, so what do you feel you are doing to help? The way this says, what are you doing? Like, how do you feel you're helping?
Well, we're all involved in different organisations and have come together. So as an organisation, we are connecting and encouraging the people that are doing different stuff. So we have connections with Trukra, Christian Aid, Tear Fund, a list of Russia. So there, some of the organisations are campaigning and advocacy. Some of them are looking after people in other parts of the world.
Yes.
Some of them are doing education around how we can do things better. There's an issue about how we invest or disinvest. So the Faith Invest connection is a big question of, it's all very well to encourage all the churches, which they have done, to divest themselves from fossil fuels. But then what? Where are we going to invest? How are we going to invest for? How are we going to invest for a community and for a world that is life-giving? So some of us are involved in the university and having conversations with people there. Some of that's just about supporting students who are doing serious research on. We have one student at the moment who's doing work that if she gets through and completes her PhD, as I think she will, she may have a very good solution for us for cleaning Loch Ness. So, so the universities are, we're trying to stay connected into the people that we know in the universities, and the universities have hosted for free, given the use of rooms and so on to do that. What are we doing? Everybody's doing their bit.
Yeah, so really, I mean, what I say you're doing, you're trying to pinpoint the need, you're trying to help people at the point of their need, which is proper.
Yeah. And there's a range of levels of that, and obviously there are the big structural things. So we're here not because we're experts, but we're here because we had the opportunity to come and encourage you for the work that you're doing, because we know that it is about everybody connecting and being encouraged and not giving up. So instead of just suffering from the grief of a climate catastrophe, that we can also act out of the love that comes from our different faiths and our respect for each other and our respect and love for the environment and the little spacecraft that's travelling around the sun, so that we can be good news for each other.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Ryan, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming in today. As the Chair said, apologies you had to wait so long, but I've met some of you before as well, so good to see you at committee. I always welcome people, I always welcome faith perspective being in the public arena, and I feel there's many attempts to squeeze faith out of the public arena, so I always welcome people bringing their faith as their motivation into societal matters and speaking up. I'm also aware that people of faith have as wide a range of political views as anyone in society. So But the question I want to ask is, what would you see as your purpose? Do you feel you want to promote a particular view, or would you see yourselves as facilitators or challengers? So do you have a particular message, or do you see yourselves as, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question, and like as I said, Join the Dots Together is a very new organisation, and I think collectively we're still trying to figure out what our core purpose is. But I would say there are a couple of things. One is about raising awareness around climate justice, particularly. So raising awareness is a key one for us. Another key one is the Join the Dots bit. You know, that there are so many different organisations that have an interest in climate change. It's a little bit, maybe in a whole big bit of their work. And so a key thing for us at the very outset was to try and make those connections between a whole range of development agencies, community groups, voluntary organisations that had an interest in climate change. And the third bit, I would say, is around the process, and the process of bringing together very diverse groups with a shared focus on faith. And that process has been, for me, it's been very, very, very powerful. So that's the way I would characterise it. But as I say, it's a very young organisation, and we haven't crystallised that collectively.
One of the things that, and you can probably pick up from my accent, that I was not born in this part of the world, but I'm missioned here to help in the Jesuit Centre. One of the things we learned with Martin Palmer was that all faith traditions value sacred space, whether it's a monastery in India, whether it's a monastery somewhere in Ireland or Britain. Sacred spaces are important, and they're preserved, and in those places nature can flourish, and they encourage education and an awareness of caring for the earth, which is what we're trying to promote. So Martin Palmer was a very inspiring speaker. He brought us afterwards up to the Giant's Ring, just above Belfast, and showed that there's a big enclosure there, which was a place where people from the area in ancient times traded, and apparently they left their arms outside the ring and entered to trade peacefully. That was an interesting learning, just going back millennia. We had another very interesting speaker, Dr. Raja Haroon, who explored the Muslim idea of caring for the common earth. And I think he took off in the experience of speaking to a largely Christian audience to say his piece. It was quite inspiring.
And that was very touching, because it came after a very hot summer. That was in September, after a very difficult summer for people who have been feeling marginalised. And we actually changed the order of things to let him speak first, because we wanted him to know that his presence and voice is valued, and that we wanted to listen and learn from him. And as we're discovering, as we listen to each other and learn from each other's faiths, we're learning that there's more of interest than I was raised to think was of value. You know, I was raised to think that what I have is the truth, and everybody else is kind of just wrong. You know, and so it's really useful for us to be listening to each other. I'm sure you're discovering that in this experience too, of being together with different labels, but that you're human beings, but you don't always disagree on everything. So I think each of us brings our own perspective. You know, mine is my love for nature, because it's God-given and created and will be restored in the fullness of when Christ comes again, but not to be dismissed or dishonoured now. And the people who live here, when Jesus says, what you do for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you do for me. So for us to neglect the people in the parts of the city that are feeling overlooked, undervalued, the parts of the city that are going to go underwater because of sea levels rising. You know, some of us have to talk about these things and say, what can we do for the least of these, and to make sure that their lives are cherished and that they get the opportunity to thrive and know that they are valued too.
Thank you. Clara, do you small?
Yeah, just very quickly, just to say, just keep doing what you're doing, because I think in the world that we now live in, things are becoming very polarised, and I think to an extent religion nearly feels like it's dividing us, whereas I do think there's a great unifying approach in faith, and I would always describe myself as having a faith rather than a religion, because I think religion to an extent is an inveigle toward faith. But certainly, and I know you have a focus on climate change, but where I would really encourage you to open up that conversation, particularly that work you're doing around young people, is the conversation we're having around ending violence against women and girls, and the kind of conversations we're having in respect of that. You know, that programme on Netflix, Adolescence, that's really, really critical to what we have to do to move forward, because I think that's telling the truth about what's really going on. And I think faith is a really great space to explore that, because it's a safe space. Certainly for me, it's a safe space, and I agree with Brian. I think it has its presence, but I would say faith rather than religion, because, you know, it's very good for reconciliation, because it is that calming space. So it's just a comment.
It's interesting that you pick up on that one, because whilst it's not our thing as us, I think probably all of us care deeply about that issue, and it is another one of those cross-cutting issues of how do we deal with the dynamics of relationships between men and women, or people of different genders, that can again bring out the best in everybody, and have a big faith that actually believes that God is doing good stuff in these people, and that we shouldn't just say, well, that's just tough, you don't fit in. So, which is where I think the problems in the world are existing now, because we are pigeonholing everyone, and there's presumptions, and you know, if you're this religion or you're this, you know, group, you have these views and you have these ideas. But actually, I think most people in the world just want to live happy, healthy lives, and it's about trying to find that common ground away from those pigeonholes, if you like. So I think that's where what you're describing in terms of climate is a good one, but certainly how we treat each other is probably the most important thing, I would say. Because even what you're talking about in terms of climate is part of that conversation too. It is very much a part of it, and it is that thing of we cannot just spend our time fighting about whether the curbstones are green and orange or red, white and blue. You know, honestly, people's well-being requires us to ensure that everybody knows that they are loved and valued and have worth. And all of us are finding that we share that value from different perspectives, and we want to make sure that that is something that everybody can know about and not be frightened into corners. You know, we've got somebody said earlier, 27 years on, it'd be nice if we could
other things.
See the richness of this place, because the history of our conflict is an opportunity for us to have overcome that and be a blessing to a world where those binaries exist everywhere. We see it with our students.
I think, Chair, one of the very powerful things that we've done is a small group has come together to study the Muslim document, Al-Mizan. And within that group, there were Muslims, Baha'is, Christians, so it was quite a diverse group, and Christians of all shades. And the Muslims in the group, there was one Sunni Muslim and one who's an Ahmadiyya Muslim. And Ahmadiyya and Sunni, in Pakistan, the Ahmadiyya Muslim are forbidden in Pakistan, so the tensions between those Muslim groups are quite severe. What we found incredibly powerful, or at least I found incredibly powerful in that group, was the way in which, whenever we looked at the Al-Mizan document, the Muslims were united around it, but the rest of us were really inspired, because we were hearing messages about Islam that we didn't understand, that we'd never heard before, but really powerful messages about the importance of working together, about us living in a global society, really strong messages about the need for people of all religions and races and nationalities to cooperate, which is totally contrary to what we pick up in the media. So it's exactly your point that it can be very powerful in terms of building relationships as well.
That's a nice message to end on. So thank you, and apologies again for keeping you. But do keep in touch when your next conference or next event or any policy documents. If you send them through, we'll be happy to look at them. But thanks again. Thank you all.
Privilege.
It was very good to have you for committee today. Okay, members, just going to move on really, really quickly just to get to correspondence. I'm going to refer you to pages 171 to 173 of your pack for the summary of committee correspondence, and I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. So 11.2, an individual correspondence was received in relation to the HII redress scheme. So I suppose if you've had a chance to read that, I think that we could ask the clerk to consider writing to the individual to express our sympathy and signpost them to VSS, who provide dedicated and specialist long-term support and services for survivors. Content?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the Committee for the Economy, Mays Long Cash Development Corporation, pages 175 to 176. So this was around the development of the site and suggesting the agreed development plans. So it's just to ask you to note this, but I think that there was a suggestion earlier in the meeting around potentially doing a site visit. So, okay, so note that. Yep. So there was a Committee for Communities, the funding for Forest na Gaeilge, pages 177 to 179. So this was in relation to the funding, to highlight the pressure, the ongoing funding issues for this body in terms of programme delivery, and just to note this correspondence and seek your agreement to correspond further if necessary when the committee is copied into reply. Content, yes. 11.5, Committee for Communities, terms of reference for civil servants undertaking co-design work. I think we could defer this till next week. Is that okay? Content?
Yeah, we've been copied into correspondence from the from the Committee for Communities to the Executive Office. So it is generally to note and to come back, but we can defer that to next week.
Yeah, maybe we could defer.
The other items.
Yeah, 11.6, 11.7. Do you want me to read them in the record, or we'll just?
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
so we're just going to defer correspondence in relation to the Balmoral show, and correspondence from Pivotal about their new report. The news release from the Executive Office around the Junior Minister's trip to Brussels, and the news release from the Executive Office in terms of the commitment to ethnic equality monitoring. Okay, so forward work programme then, if people have had a chance to look at that, if they have any suggestions or if they're content with the programme. Okay.
Sorry, Chair, just 2 wee changes just to talk through in regards to the forward programme just really quickly. So, as the clerk touched on earlier, the EU Affairs Manager will provide a briefing ahead of the departmental briefing on EU Affairs, and she will cover common frameworks in the process more generally and give an overview on current EU matters, which will be a really helpful briefing before the department. And just to say, it's been added to the 14th of May. RAISE will come back to present their updated paper on legacy in the Republic of Ireland that day.
Very good.
Okay.
Okay, any other business members? Okay, go ahead, Carol, please. Thank you, Carol. Please go ahead.
Yeah, Chair, I missed the start of the committee, so I just wanted to raise this under AOB. Do we know if the department, do you remember we had a closed session with some of the survivors, victims and survivors of mother and baby institutions? Do we know if the department and we wrote to the department, are they treating the concerns we raised as complaints? Or are they coming back to us about complaints that have been made?
I think sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Paula.
I was going to say they have responded quite factually. There's papers in there, but in terms of the individual, we did receive, the clerk and myself today, we did receive correspondence from one of those ladies to say what is happening as a follow-up. So I think that there is a wee bit of work to sort of knit that together a wee bit in terms of the actual complaint as opposed to the wider issues of concern that have been raised with this committee. That makes sense?
It does, because we're all kind of meeting small groups, which are quite disparate from all over the place, and I certainly had to explain that because concerns were raised and were raised by the committee, it's not up to us to pursue the complaints on behalf of the officials. It's up to the officials to deal with the complaints they've made. So I think it'd be worthwhile even if we could just write and ask for an update in terms of that, because notwithstanding any review or investigation, I don't want this committee been brought into something either the people raising issues with us through a lack of understanding of what our role is. So it's just to get that clear.
Okay, so the clerk's just reminded me that there was quite a lot came back from the department, and it is in the pack today. So we actually have deferred to give us an extra week to look at that and sort of bottom some of these other issues out. Because one of the issues, for example, that I wanted to raise today was that I asked the departmental official for a full breakdown of all the funding that's gone. And in the pack that came back, the information, it wasn't there. So I think that there's a few wee bits that we just all need to review it. Yeah, so next week I'll be back on. Did you say somebody else was looking in? Go ahead, Brian, please.
Well, you pointed out, I mean, there is quite a lengthy reply from the department, in fairness. I was also aware that was the evidence we took was in closed session, you know, and if we were going to get into a debate on that, we might have to think whether we should do that in closed session, you know, but
we could possibly do that for next week. Yeah, once we've had time to really reflect on the stuff that's come in. Go ahead again, Carol.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so I think certainly there are sensitivities about doing things in open and closed session, particularly when people have raised concerns. But if we, as a general rule of thumb, do this in open, because I just think it doesn't look well in terms of people watching the committee. But the other thing about it is maybe in advance of the committee next week, we can have another look to see where the gaps are, and if we need to break into closed session during it, well and good, but my preference would be to do it in open session because there are lots of people watching this committee.
That's absolutely right. I totally agree with you and noted. So we've got another week to look. We'll come back to this next week, and okay, thank you for that. Thanks everybody. See you all next week.